Welcome, traveler. Tonight, let us drift back slowly, gently into the salt-laced winds and wooden bones of a time long past. Close your eyes if you like, or simply rest them on the horizon of your mind. You're no longer in your bed. You're standing on the deck of a creaking Spanish galleon. Somewhere in the year 1582, the sails above you are swollen with Atlantic air. Ropes groan softly, and the hull sways like a cradle on a vast, dark sea. This ship is no luxury cruise. It's one of many vessels dispatched by an empire, hunting gold, glory, and sometimes just the next coastline. Below your feet lie chests of silver bound for the crown, boxes of cacao and tobacco, and sacks of dried biscuits so hard even the rats seem to gnaw around them. You are now part of that crew, or at least you're meant to imagine you are. And tonight, as the moon rises, we'll sail together through the quiet torments and curious wonders of life aboard a 16th-century Spanish galleon. This journey will not be rushed. It will unfold like a tide, slow, relentless, and sometimes surprising. We'll begin below deck, shoulder to shoulder with the weary and the bitten. Later, we'll uncover tales of doomed ships, impossible myths, and the strange feasts enjoyed far away by men who never saw salt on their skin. There is no need to stay alert. Let the rhythm of wood and water carry you. If your eyes close, so be it. We'll still be here, charting old waters, whispering stories from a world that once was. Let's begin, ... below deck. Chapter 1. Rowing in shifts below deck with rats and salt. There's no sun where you live now. Only the breath of others, the scrape of chains, and the squeak of fat, glossy rats navigating the beams above. The air is too thick to breathe deeply without tasting iron and damp wood. You're in the lower hold of a galleon, wedged between barrels of salted cod, coils of rough hemp rope, and men who haven't bathed in weeks. If you want space, you'll have to wait until someone dies, or gets promoted to topside, which is about as likely as finding a ripe melon in the bilge. Your shift began at dawn, though down here, dawn is more of an idea than a reality. A crewman passed by with a lamp and kicked your foot. That's how time works here, by kicks, bells, and curses. You haul yourself from the hammock netting strung between beams, ducking to avoid the dripping ceiling. The salt air outside would almost be welcome if it didn't immediately sting every crack in your skin. You swing into position on the oar bench, your hands already blistered, your shoulders groaning from yesterday, and the day before. And the day before that, there are 30 of you rowing. Sometimes more, when the wind dies. The galleon isn't a galley by design, but desperate times call for desperate arms. You pull in rhythm with a drum, hit once every few seconds. The man beating it is just as tired as you, but at least he gets to sit up high. You row because there's no choice. You row because the captain says you do. You row, mostly, because stopping would mean punishment. Or worse, being left behind the next time this ship makes landfall. And no one wants to be left behind in unfamiliar territory with nothing but a pair of threadbare breeches and lice. The food is the same every day. Salted pork if you're lucky. Hardtack biscuits most of the time. They're so dense they sometimes break teeth. You learn to soak them in whatever liquid you can find. Beer, broth, seawater, if you're desperate enough. Some men pretend they taste of butter. Most just chew with their eyes closed. The rats, oddly enough, seem to prefer the pork. They come out at night, clicking claws and yellow teeth flashing in the lamplight. One climbed over your foot 2 nights ago. You didn't move. You were too tired to care. There's a man across from you with a cough that sounds like a drowning bird. He won't last long. Nobody says it, but everyone knows. You'd think that would make space easier to come by, but another body just means more stink, more sickness. They'll probably throw him overboard by week's end, after muttering a few words from a priest who's just as sleep-deprived as the rest of you. And then, when you sleep that night, you'll still feel his foot pressed against yours in the dark, even though it's gone. The worst part isn't the rowing, it's the stillness. When the wind picks up and the sails do their job, you'd think relief would wash over you. But all it does is give you time to think. About the land you left behind. About the woman you didn't marry. About the smell of oranges in the market and how long it's been since you smelled anything fresh. Some men talk of going back. Some talking riches. Most say nothing at all. They just row, eat, sleep, and scratch. If you get promoted, if your reward might be the upper deck. It sounds better until you realize that up there, you're one wrong word from being flogged. Or thrown into the sea during a storm to lighten the load. Still, at least up there you might see the sky. Or hear something other than rats and the low groan of the hull. Someone sneezes behind you, violently. A string of curses follows. You don't even turn, you just grip the oar tighter, one more pull, then another. The rhythm is the only thing keeping your bones from breaking entirely. And you wonder, as your hands ache and your ears ring, what exactly did you do to end up here? Was it a crime? A draft? Or did you just believe a merchant who promised gold, adventure, and an easier life at sea? Spoiler, he lied. It's the second week since your last sight of land, and already the line between day and night has blurred beyond recognition. Sleep comes in scattered pieces, measured in moments stolen between shifts or during a lull in the waves. You lie flat when you can, curled between barrels that groan as the ship sways, and you dream not of riches, not of glory, but of bread that isn't hard enough to hammer nails with, and water that doesn't taste faintly of rusted iron and bilge. Your clothing has stiffened with salt, not just from the sea, but from your own body sweat, skin, and the fine white dust that crusts into every fold of fabric. It's like wearing armor made of damp burlap. You itch constantly. Fleas, some say. Or just salt finding its way into every pore. Either way, there's no relief. You scratch when no one's looking and try not to do it near your food. In the lowest part of the hold, a man named Mateo has started talking to the ship. He says she whispers to him when the deck goes quiet, says she has a woman's voice and a cruel sense of humor. No one really laughs at that, not out loud anyway, but you all listen. Because when you're this far from land, even madness sounds like company. Sometimes it's better to believe the ship is alive than to accept that you are just floating on wooden prayer, thousands of leagues from anything familiar. You've learned to count the days by the bread. Fresh bread lasted 3 days. After that, the loaves grew harder, darker, less distinct. On day 7, someone bit into one and cracked a tooth. On day 10, you saw the ship's cook drop a biscuit and kick it under a bench like it was a stone. If anyone asks what day it is now, you all just say, stale. That's become the calendar. Not Monday or Thursday. Just stale. The older sailors carry lucky charms, twine bracelets, carved crosses, a saint's medallion, worn thin with rubbing. You picked up a charm yourself, a tiny brass spoon that washed up on deck one morning after a storm. No one claimed it. Now it dangles from your shirt, and you find your hand moving toward it when the waves grow restless, or when thunder murmurs somewhere far off. Is it foolish? Probably. But in a place where lightning strikes the sea and men vanish overboard without a trace, a little foolishness is just another kind of insurance. Every few days, a barrel gets tapped. It's water, technically, but it tastes like wood and something vaguely sour. You drink it anyway. You have to. The sun might not visit you down here, but thirst always finds a way in. And the body, no matter how weary, still clings to the habit of survival. So you gulp the warm liquid, wince, and wipe your mouth on a sleeve already stiff with grime. There's a bucket system. You pretend it doesn't exist and try to never be the one chosen to empty it. That task usually goes to the youngest. A boy named Andres has the job this week. He can't be more than 14, and already his eyes look older than most. He never speaks unless spoken to, and even then, it's just a nod or a shake of the head. His hands are always red, always trembling. When the bucket sloshes too much, the others mutter. One man threw a boot once. Missed, but the message landed just fine. No one fights below deck, not really. There's no room to. The closest thing to violence is muttering threats or the occasional elbow when space gets tight. Besides, real punishment doesn't come from fists. It comes from above. The bosun's lash sings a cruel song, and no one wants to hear it up close. So you keep your head down, your voice low, and your complaints to yourself. Outside, you imagine, The ocean stretches in all directions like a wrinkled quilt. The sails flutter and snap. Birds sometimes trail the ship, white flecks on an endless canvas of blue. But down here you only hear it. The groaning of the hull, the soft slap of water against wood, the rustle of canvas above like some enormous beast breathing in its sleep. You imagine the sky sometimes, but memory can only hold so much. Eventually even that begins to fade. You notice things changing. The cook no longer smells like garlic, just like grease and smoke. The man beside you has started mumbling names in his sleep, names no one recognizes. And someone somewhere in the dark has been carving tally marks into the wood near the ladder. No one admits to it, but the marks grow steadily each day. You're not sure if they're counting days, deaths, or just moments of clarity. And yet, for all this discomfort, there's a strange rhythm to it all. A grim predictability. Wake, row, eat, row, sleep, scratch, repeat. You begin to forget what day it is, what month. You're not sure if it matters. You start dreaming of land as if it's some mythical place, a village with a fountain, a loaf of soft bread on a wooden table, a woman humming while shelling peas. Silly, almost embarrassingly domestic things. But they warm the corners of your mind when the cold sets in. Then one day, if you can call it a day, a change arrives. A sound, faint at first, a scraping above, a call from the crow's nest. The word spreads slowly like heat through molasses. Land, not sighted, not confirmed, just a possibility. Men shift. They mutter. You grip your lucky spoon without thinking. Maybe it's nothing. A mirage. A sailor's false hope. But still your heart beats just a little faster. Not fast enough to wake you fully. Just enough to remind you. You're still alive. For now. Chapter 2. The Last Voyage of the San Esteban Segment 1. Not every ship that left Spain made it home. In fact, many didn't. The ocean, for all its majesty, has always had a tendency to forget names. And so we begin this chapter with one that nearly slipped into silence forever, the San Esteban. A vessel with gold in her belly, secrets in her rigging, and saltwater slowly claiming her story until the tide one day revealed her bones again. The fleet set sail late in the season, when hurricanes stir in the Gulf like spoons in boiling broth. Captain Francisco de Leon had concerns. Days passed with relative ease, though the crew, some veterans of earlier crossings, exchanged glances each night when the moon refused to show. And then, in the stretch of sea just off the coast of what would become Texas, the sky darkened in a way no candle or prayer could fix. But the San Esteban lagged. Maybe her rudder faltered, maybe her sails failed, or maybe fate had already decided. The water around her churned with mud, wood, and bodies. Those who could swim tried. Those who COULD and then single quotes T vanished. When the storm cleared, the San Esteban lay broken, scattered across the shallows, her masts gone. Her cargo tossed like bones across the Gulf shore, not because of the lives lost, but because of what else was lost with them. The treasure, the paperwork, the sense of imperial infallibility. Spain had grown used to success. This was inconvenient. An inquiry was held. Blame was assigned carefully, like powder in a dry room. Most of it landed on the captain, as it often did, though the storm itself was declared an act of God. Convenient. Survivors clawed their way onto the beach, gazed, bloodied, and blinking up at a sun that felt like mockery. The San Esteban became just another line in the logbook. And then, centuries later, a storm of a different kind, an archaeological one, brought her name back from the seabed. Either way, she was driven relentlessly toward the shore, the quiet after the storm. The sun rising over a still coast, a galleon no longer roaring across the sea, but whispering under the waves. Spanish coins, cannonballs, broken ceramics painted with cobalt flowers. Her silver rests behind glass, her timbers catalogued and preserved. The crew remains largely anonymous, no statues, no hymns, just a few faded names and the bones of their voyage scattered like confessions along the shore. The remains of a 16th century ship that had been pulled apart by waves, then slowly buried in sand and time. The San Esteban had returned, not sailing, but sleeping. Not a soft beach, but a jagged, marshy coastline that welcomed her not with comfort, but with ruin. He wasn't a superstitious man by most accounts, but even he had begun to mutter prayers under his breath. And by the time the crew realized what was coming, it was already too late. The hurricane struck like a beast, unchained. The wrecked crew were stranded in unfamiliar land, low on provisions, and under no illusions about how far they were from home. Others tried to salvage what they could from the wrecked tools, food, anything not already lost to the tide. A few clung stubbornly to chests of silver, convinced they could carry wealth across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. It was said one man, a former notary, drowned trying to drag a single coin-filled box across a flooded inlet. His body was found days later, still gripping the chest. The silver had kept him company all the way down. They buried their dead quickly, more out of necessity than ritual, and turned their attention to survival. Disease, exposure, and skirmishes with native groups whittled their numbers until the survivors resembled ghosts more than men. They eventually reached a settlement barefoot, gaunt, and carrying not treasure, but stories. It swallowed the horizon in gray, tore the sails to ribbons, and turned the sea itself into a weapon. Waves the size of houses rolled over decks. Men screamed. Orders were shouted, then lost in the wind. The San Esteban twisted and groaned under the pressure, her timbers flexing with every crashing surge. The clouds were the wrong color. The winds too insistent. Still, orders were orders and treasure waits for no man, not even a nervous one. Imagine now the San Esteban bobbing gently in the harbor of Havana, her sails still furled, her hold packed with treasure and goods bound for the Spanish crown. It's 1554. She's part of a small convoy. The so-called flota tasked with ferrying precious cargo from the New World back across the Atlantic. Her hull holds silver, copper ingots, rare feathers, and something even more precious to the empire: order. Every voyage represented more than just wealth. It was proof that Spain's expanding grip had not yet loosened. But the San Esteban would not complete her journey. Her trouble didn't begin with pirates or cannon fire. It began, as many tragedies do, with poor timing and worse luck. The voyage began calmly enough. The ships followed the coastline, hugging the curve of the Yucatan before turning north. There were no forecasts, no barometers, only instincts and observation. Some of the ships in the fleet managed to veer east, running desperately with the storm, hoping to ride its fury rather than resist it. She struck reef or sandbar. We're not sure which. You might think rescue would be swift. It wasn't. The coast was remote, wild, and watched by native tribes who were understandably wary of European arrivals. According to scattered reports, some attempted to walk inland, hoping to reach Spanish settlements. Of the hundreds aboard the San Esteban, only a handful survived the weeks that followed. Back in Spain, news of the loss caused mild panic. The wreck was largely forgotten over time. New ships sailed. New riches flowed. In the 1970s, amateur divers and researchers exploring the Texas coast began finding strange artifacts. And so today, pieces of her story sit in museums. Imagine that now as you rest. The rediscovery of the San Esteban did not make headlines in every home, but for the small, careful world of maritime historians and underwater archaeologists, it was a whisper from the past loud enough to change how we understood their early colonial era. Then fragments of hull, still locked together by ancient nails, a wooden comb still intact, a pewter spoon bent as if dropped in haste. You might think the treasure was the highlight of the excavation. In truth, it was a footnote. The ink was smeared, the parchment torn, but a few words stood out. The way her ribs lay in the sand suggested she struck hard and fast, likely driven by storm surges onto a shallow reef. In one case, a Spanish dagger was discovered nearly a mile from the shoreline, buried beneath layers of sediment and tangled roots. No body nearby. Just the blade, wedged in a way that suggested haste or fear, or perhaps both. No one ever found the name of its owner. The cargo hold had burst from below. Her sides cracked, like a poorly made barrel, and barefoot, with only a single earring left to identify him as an officer. He claimed he had been the last to leave the ship, helping two younger crewmen swim to shore. Their names were never recorded, just a subtle sign, a small museum exhibit, and the knowledge that beneath the shallow waves lies a fractured skeleton of wood and iron. Somewhere below, the San Esteban sleeps, her final voyage paused in silence. And just above, the ghosts of her crew drift quietly, no longer rowing, no longer shouting, only waiting, as the waves roll in and out like the breath of the deep. A reminder that even the mightiest ships could be undone by nature, poor timing, and the quiet indifference of the sea. Vargas disappeared from the records after that. No burial notice, no pension claims, as if the land itself had decided it was done with him. The position of cannonballs and anchors revealed last-minute efforts to lighten her load. Desperate work, too late. But the wreck left a mark, not on the empire, but on the coast it touched. Local fishermen swore the waters there were cursed. They avoided it for decades, even when fish were plentiful. Children were told not to swim too far. If they asked why, they were simply told, that's where the drowned men whisper. Among them was a phrase repeated twice, the sea will not forgive. Whether he meant the ocean itself, or the choices that led them into it, is lost to us now. Stories began resurfacing of local legends passed through generations, of glowing lights seen in the water, of strange bones washed ashore. There's something uniquely powerful about an incomplete story. Something haunting about questions without answers. Who exactly survived? What path did they take? Did any of them ever reach home? Were they believed when they arrived? Sun-scorched and half-starved, with tales of storms and drowning? One tale told of a woman who found a coin in the mouth of a fish and wore it around her neck for luck. Another claimed that pieces of the ship had been used to build a small chapel on the coast, the altar made from her deck beams. Likely myth. But myth, like salt, clings to everything it touches. But that line, so brief and quiet, lingers. Most of the recovered silver had little monetary value after centuries of exposure, but it was a tangible echo. A link in the long chain that connected empire, exploration, and all the lives caught between. Fragments of rosaries worn down by fingers long gone. These were not royal relics. They were humble, ordinary, but somehow more haunting than any jeweled cross. They spoke of lives interrupted, a comb left mid-stroke, a spoon dropped during a meal never finished. In the silence of the ocean floor, these details whispered louder than cannon fire. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A few centimeters of visibility, a shape in the gloom, a hand reaching down. And suddenly, a centuries-old ceramic cup rises toward the surface, catching the sunlight for the first time in over 400 years. The sea does not easily give up its secrets. But the San Esteban slowly did. You might picture a team of divers in sleek suits, cameras in hand, descending through crystal-clear waters to retrieve glittering gold. The reality, as ever, was much humbler. The waters off the Texas coast were often murky, visibility low, the bottom shifting with every tide. The divers groped through sand and silt, not jewels and coins, but ballast stones and barnacled wood. The treasure, if you could call it that, was patience. They found anchors first. Bent iron, rusted to the point of crumbling at the edges. Among the most curious discoveries were not gold or weaponry, but the personal items of the crew. There were coins, of course. Spanish reales stamped with royal crests, some so freshly minted when the ship sank that the die marks were still sharp. One recovered journal fragment, badly water-damaged and barely legible, seemed to belong to a minor officer. Modern scientists reconstructed the ship's final hours based on the debris field. Some items were found far from the wreck site, dragged inland by floods or perhaps carried by survivors hoping to hide something. The wreck spurred renewed interest in other lost ships of the Gulf. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the San Esteban was not in what was recovered, but in what was not. One report mentions a man named Vargas, who walked into a Spanish outpost 6 weeks after the shipwreck. Alone back in Spain, the crown moved on. Another fleet was dispatched. More gold filled the coffers. Today, The site is marked quietly. No grand monument, no commemorative plaque that sings with drama. As you rest now, think of that shoreline, wind brushing across the marshes, water lapping against half-buried timbers, the sun setting in gold and violet hues. Chapter 3, Maps, Myths, and the Fountain of Youth. Long before satellites painted coastlines with perfect precision, the maps that guided Spanish explorers were stitched together with fragments of memory, hearsay, and hope. Every expedition that sailed westward brought back new lines, new shapes, and new mistakes. A bay might become an island. A peninsula might be charted as a dragon's tail. The sea was not just an expanse of water. It was a space filled with promises and impossibilities, drawn by men who knew only pieces of the whole and filled the blanks with dreams. Or, more often, fears. You would find these early maps in the hands of pilots and captains, each one weathered, cracked at the folds, stained by salt spray and fingertips. They were not symmetrical or clean. A coast might slant wildly. Inland rivers forked like veins. Mountains loomed at impossible angles. Some bore careful annotations. Others featured drawings of sea monsters so elaborate they seemed almost affectionate. One popular chart from the late 1500s included a note near the Gulf of Mexico that read, "Here be death, not helpful, but honest." And then, of course, there were the legends. Chief among them, the Fountain of Youth, a spring of clear water said to restore health, erase age, and, depending on who was doing the selling, maybe even absolve sin. Sailors whispered of it over bread crusts and briny stew. Nobles obsessed over it from their palaces, commissioning expeditions to find its hidden source. It was said to be guarded by fierce tribes, shrouded in jungle, tucked beyond swamps where compasses spun and birds fell silent. It was a tale so powerful that it turned from myth into mission. You've likely heard of Ponce de Leon, the man most famously tied to this pursuit. But the truth, as always, is messier than the schoolbooks allow. Ponce wasn't some naive romantic chasing fairy water. He was a hardened soldier, a governor, and a man deeply entangled in the politics of early colonial power. The legend attached to him like barnacles after the fact, perhaps, because it made a better story than the actual one, which involved power struggles, land claims, and quite a few bad decisions. Still, even if the fountain wasn't his true goal, Ponce and his men did search Florida's lush interior with a kind of hungry reverence. What they found were tangled mangroves, biting insects, and native resistance that grew bolder with every Spanish step. The jungle gave them water, yes, but not youth. Just illness, disorientation, and the creeping suspicion that they had been lied to. Or worse, that they had lied to themselves, but the myth didn't die. It simply changed costumes. In another version, the fountain lay not in Florida, but deep within the Orinoco Basin, or maybe along the shores of Lake Nicaragua, or buried beneath what would one day become the streets of St. Augustine. Each explorer returned with new clues. None returned with proof, and still, the dream endured. Because it wasn't really about water, it was about escape. Escape from age, from death, from the consequences of all that conquest. Other myths joined the cartographic choir. El Dorado, the Golden Man, the Golden City, the Golden Kingdom. A place where the streets glittered and kings powdered themselves with gold dust. No one could agree where it was, but that never stopped anyone from setting out. You might laugh at the idea now, sitting comfortably in a warm bed. But imagine yourself a sailor with nothing but sore feet and a debt to your name. A map with a golden dot might seem more trustworthy than the cold certainty of poverty. And it wasn't just gold and youth. Some maps spoke of a strait that cut straight through the Americas, allowing ships to pass from ocean to ocean in days rather than months. Others promised islands where dogs spoke Latin, or beaches where it rained cinnamon. There were lands of giants, lands of pygmies, lands ruled by Amazonian women who wielded copper weapons and worshipped the moon. For every discovery that narrowed the known world, a new tale widened it again. The Spanish crown, naturally, encouraged these rumors selectively. A hopeful story inspired investors. A fantastical claim could secure another grant, another ship, another season of exploration. It was a delicate game of believing just enough to justify action, while denying responsibility when the truth disappointed. When a sailor returned with a cracked compass and an empty hand, he was not blamed for failure. He was praised for ruling out yet another part of the map. And yet, despite the exaggeration and invention, some of those fantastical maps weren't entirely wrong. Rivers existed where myths said they did. Vast civilizations rose and fell far from the coasts where Spanish ships had first landed. The lines were crooked, the names were fanciful. But beneath it all, there was a genuine desire to understand a world that seemed infinite and unknowable. To name it, even if the names were borrowed from bedtime stories. Imagine the candlelit cabin of a navigator late at night. The ship groans beneath him, anchored in some shallow bay. Rain pelts the deck above. He leans over parchment, eyes bleary, hands steady. He draws what he's seen, a reef here, a cove there, and then, in the corner, sketches a crude outline of a creature he can't quite explain. A fish with legs, a bird with teeth. A story told by a native guide, half translated and poorly remembered, but he draws it anyway, just in case. Because in the 16th century, not knowing was more dangerous than being wrong. In the flickering light of those early maps, truth and fantasy walk side by side, indistinguishable to most. A bay shaped like a crescent moon could be labeled as enchanted. A desert might be marked with skulls. These flourishes weren't always mistakes. Sometimes they were warnings. Sometimes they were invitations. And often they were simply placeholders for ignorance. Cartographers had to make choices. They had too many blanks and too few facts. Not just for themselves, but for the wounded world around them. Letters sent home began to mock the idea, if only privately. They were easier to remember, easier to sell, and much easier to believe when you were soaked, hungry, and surrounded by trees taller than cathedrals. Artists who had never left the city rendered waterfalls pouring from cliffs lined with fruit trees, and muscular, ageless men lounging in crystal pools. Just as the maps bore false promises, so too did the voyage. They were told they would gain land, gold, honor. It is the persistence. The refusal to admit the world has no more surprises. Their dragons and giants still leer from the margins. Their coastlines still loop and twist like ribbon. And somewhere always there is an X, a mark, a clue, a silent promise. That maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the endless folds of forest and stone, there still might be one place where the water runs sweet, the air smells of orchids. The sails are full. The crew speaks in hushed tones, and in the captain's cabin, a chart lies open. A single word glows faintly under the candle, youth. And a man might sit by the spring and forget, if only for a moment, all the things that time has taken. Instead, many gained illness, injury, and a slow, grinding awareness that they were very far from the places they knew, and even farther from the ones they had imagined. These visions were copied, sold, and displayed in private halls like postcards from a better world. We still want to believe there are places that can make us whole again. The names are different now. The places have shifted. But the longing, that strange ache for something just beyond the edge of what we know, is the same. The irony, of course, was that the artists were often inspired by Roman ruins and Moorish gardens, not actual accounts from the New World. The imagined paradise was stitched from pieces of home. A captain might return empty-handed from a failed voyage and still receive a hero welcome if he claimed to have caught a glimpse of golden towers in the mist. People wanted to believe, not just in wealth, but in wonder. The unknown was terrifying. But wonder gave it shape. One lieutenant wrote to his cousin in Seville, "We have found many springs, but none that reverse a man's years. Only those that turn bread to mush and stomachs inside out." Another, more bitter, joked that the only thing youthful about the jungle was how often it laughed at them. Even when the maps were proven wrong, when the rivers led to swamps, when the golden cities turned out to be adobe villages, the men still dreamed. They drew new maps, they moved the mountains, shifted the rivers, The fountain must be over the next ridge. El Dorado must be behind the next bend. It was always just a few leagues further. Always just out of reach. They weren't merely seeking to cheat time. They were looking for something pure, something untouched. Of course, what they found, dense jungle, heat snakes, and unfriendly locals suggested that paradise, if it existed, was well guarded. And so they filled in the spaces with what they'd been told, or what they feared, or what they hoped was out there. Imagination became geography. You might find it strange that trained navigators placed such faith in drawings of lands they had never seen. But consider this, maps were not just tools for travel. Some truly believed in what they were seeking. Others simply needed a direction, a goal, a story that might get them out of debt or poverty. Some were criminals, pardoned on the condition that they serve at sea. Others were sons of minor nobles trying to carve their own place in the world. And in their hands, the maps became more than parchment. They became prophecy. They were instruments of empire. To draw a thing was to claim it. Even if no Spaniard had ever walked its forests or sailed its rivers, once it appeared on the map with a Spanish name, it belonged, at least in theory, to the Spanish crown. And so, kingdoms were born in ink before blood was ever spilled on their soil. The men who followed these maps were a strange mix of the devout and the desperate. One of the more enduring myths that made it onto paper was the land of Bimini, somewhere to the northwest of Hispaniola. It was said that there, a magical spring flowed clear and cold, its waters capable of restoring youth to the old, vigor to the weak, and sight to the blind. The legend had deep roots, likely carried over from older European stories, twisted and retold by indigenous peoples and then repeated by sailors who had heard just enough to believe. It wasn't always cynical. For many who had seen too much war, too much death, the idea of a healing spring held a kind of desperate appeal. Even within the Spanish ranks, skepticism crept in. Still, the stories persisted. One reason was simple. Stories travel better than facts. Back in Spain, merchants and nobles commissioned paintings of these imagined lands. In some strange way, the obsession with mythical geography mirrored the experience of the sailors themselves, and yet, hope did not die easily. That is the curious thing. If there is something deeply human in all this, it is not the gullibility. Today, you can find replica maps of these early explorers hanging in museums and libraries. Perhaps we have not changed all that much. We still search for answers in old maps. So, as you drift tonight, picture a ship slipping quietly through warm water, guided by starlight and a map inked in dreams. Chapter 4. Banquets in gold in a Seville merchant villa, while men at sea hauled ropes. Rationed water and prayed for wind, life in Seville moved to a slower, far more luxurious rhythm. The same gold that clinked in the hulls of Spanish galleons found its way into the tiled courtyards and candlelit halls of grand merchant villas. Here, the floors were cool, the beds were soft, and the only salty air came from cured hams hanging in the kitchens. To walk into one of these villas in the late 1500s was to enter a world entirely removed from the labor that funded it. Picture this, a high-walled courtyard shaded by orange trees, their blossoms perfuming the air. A fountain burbles quietly in the center, its tiles gleaming in the Andalusian sun. Laughter floats through archways. The servants are invisible, moving like whispers from room to room, refilling goblets and removing crumbs. No one asks where the wine came from or how the silk arrived. They already know. From elsewhere, from someone else's hands. The wealth of Seville did not flow evenly, of course. But for those who had managed to secure positions within the empire's inner commercial web merchants, financiers and government officials, the riches arriving from the New World offered not just prosperity, but insulation. Life was safer here, cleaner, predictable. While storms battered the Gulf and men like Mateo and Andres rode themselves into exhaustion, Seville's elite dined on trout, drank aged wine from Portugal, and debated art by lamplight. Inside the villa, you might find tapestries depicting biblical scenes or Roman myths woven in Flanders or Florence. There would be imported blue and white porcelain from China, purchased secondhand through Lisbon smugglers. Gold was not just in coin, it was hammered into candle holders, inlaid in furniture, threaded into the edge of robes. And yet, even in all this beauty, there was something uneasy beneath the surface. Because everyone in the room knew that for this elegance to endure, ships had to keep sailing, men had to keep dying, and gold had to keep coming. One prominent merchant, Don Alvaro de Trejo, was known to throw lavish feasts every time one of his ships returned from the Indies. These were not quiet family meals. They were grand spectacles, rows of roasted meats, towers of sugared fruit, music echoing off the stone walls, imported parrots perched above the guests, more decoration than living creature. He once reportedly served a pudding so large it required its own table, carved in the shape of a Spanish galleon, its sails made of marzipan. And yet, at these feasts, little was said of the voyages themselves. The word storm rarely passed anyone's lips. The sailors were distant abstractions, necessary, but replaceable. They were names on ledgers, heads on a tally sheet. When a ship was lost, there were sighs, but no tears. The sea is jealous, one guest once remarked casually, while spearing a fig. It never lets us keep everything. Everyone chuckled. Then the musicians played again. These banquets served another purpose beyond indulgence. They were a kind of theater, a way of affirming that Spain's expansion was not just brutal or ambitious, but glorious. The guests played their roles. They toasted the king. They praised God. They praised the ingenuity of those who had mapped distant coastlines and claimed strange new fruits. They did not ask whose hands picked them. Still, not all in attendance were blind to the cost. There are letters, buried in archives, that suggest some of the younger sons, those without titles, but with education, felt annoying discomfort. One noble wrote to his brother abroad, "I ate off gold today, but it tasted like blood." Another confessed in a private diary that the sound of ships docking at the Guadalquivir filled him not with pride, but with dread. He had seen once the condition of the men who returned. Not the captains, not the officers, but the ones who had rowed, cooked, and cleaned. Their eyes were hollow, their backs twisted, and yet they received no applause. They vanished into side streets, paid in coin and forgotten by morning. The villa walls kept much of this discomfort out. They were thick, cool, and built to buffer not just noise, but reality. The women of the house, daughters of merchants and bureaucrats, were schooled in manners, languages, and music. They played the vihuela under painted ceilings, read translated romances, and arranged their hair with combs made of tortoiseshell and ivory. Their world, while not entirely free, was decorated and curated to near perfection. From time to time, a letter would arrive from across the sea delivered weeks late, creased, smelling faintly of mold. It might contain news of a delay, a damaged hull, a captain's illness. Occasionally, it bore worse tidings. Ship presumed lost, cargo value unknown, survivors not yet confirmed. These messages were received in the drawing room, opened carefully, then placed in drawers beneath family Bibles or devotional statues. Life went on. The table was still set. The guests still came. Even the architecture of these villas reflected a kind of curated denial. The rooms were built around courtyards, facing inward, away from the noise of the city. The sea, which made their wealth possible, could not be seen or heard from the garden. The only waves here were those of embroidered silk. The only storms, those discussed in metaphors or poetry. There were servants, of course. Dozens, some born in Spain, others purchased elsewhere. Most never mentioned by name. They moved like shadows, trained to anticipate the needs of their masters before a single word was spoken. They heard every toast, every whisper, every boast. But no one asked what they thought, or whether they, too, dreamed of springs that brought back youth, or cities of gold that might one day free them. As the sun dipped and lanterns were lit, the villa glowed with soft amber. Musicians tuned their strings, wine flowed. The air smelled of roasted garlic and clove. And somewhere far away, across an ocean dark and wide, another ship rocked gently in its moorings, waiting to sail. No one at the banquet knew its name. No one would remember it after it sank. But they would still raise a glass, still feast, still sleep soundly behind thick painted walls. The merchant villas of Seville didn't just display wealth, they preserved it, groomed it, and wrapped it in ritual. From the outside, they appeared modest, often hidden behind heavy doors and blank street-facing walls, as if to suggest restraint. But once inside, it was a different world. The floors were cooled with hand-laid tiles from Granada, patterned in repeating Moorish geometry that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon light. Water moved in small, deliberate trickles through courtyard fountains, creating a sound that seemed engineered to soften the air itself. Each villa had its rhythm, one set not by clocks, but by custom. Breakfast was light, a sweet bread, some fresh fruit if in season, watered wine or bitter chocolate. Then came business, meetings in shaded arcades with other merchants, clerks reading aloud lists of cargo, brokers offering letters of credit for goods that hadn't even touched land yet. There were risks to be discussed, losses to be concealed. And always at the center of every conversation, the ships, their names spoken like prayers, their arrivals and absences weighed like omens. In the cool of the early afternoon, the family withdrew from sunlight. Curtains were drawn, voices hushed. The villa slowed. Servants moved silently, brushing dust from ledges, folding linens, lighting candles in windowless rooms where imported ivory glowed under a flickering flame. Even in this stillness, gold glinted. Not just coins in safe boxes, but edges of books, inlays on armchairs, embroidery on pillows. The empire's wealth had been braided into every part of the home. Yet, for all this comfort, there was a lingering tension beneath it. The kind of tension that grows when one half of a system lives in profound ease and the other in unrecorded strain. The merchants were not fools. They understood the cost of what they possessed. They had read the logs, heard the confessions of priests who had traveled back from the Americas, carrying with them not gold but remorse. And just a few had begun to ask questions, quietly, in journals or to trusted friends. Questions like, how much is too much? Or, what happens when the gold runs out? These questions were not asked at dinner, of course. The table was sacred, a place for performance, linen cloth, imported and bleached, plates of painted tin or polished silver, food arranged in ways that seemed designed more for admiration than for hunger. A roasted quail seated atop a mound of almonds. Cheese from the north, floating in oil and herbs. Fake split and filled with soft goat cheese. A knife for every course. A bowl of rose water for rinsing fingers. And all of it served in silence, with eyes politely downcast. Among the guests were not only other merchants, but sometimes minor nobles, bishops, and occasionally visiting envoys from Italy or the Low Countries. They spoke Spanish with heavy accents, nodded often, and brought gifts, carvings, books, even dogs bred for their silence. These gatherings were about more than appetite. They were about positioning, who sat nearest the host, who toasted the crown first, who could recite the newest decree from Madrid without pausing for breath. Sometimes the conversation drifted accidentally, perhaps to the world outside, a failed expedition, a mutiny in Panama. A priest who had gone mad during a voyage and declared himself a prophet. These moments passed quickly, often followed by laughter or a sudden shift in topic. It wasn't denial, exactly. It was preference. They chose, again and again, to look inward, to believe that what happened across the sea was far enough away to remain unreal. But it wasn't. The city itself reminded them. At the docks, you could see it clearly. Men returning with hollow cheeks, their skin burned raw, their hands permanently curled from work. Boys too young to carry a blade unloading barrels filled with tobacco or sugar or ore. These weren't the exotic treasures promised in paintings. These were the byproducts of empire. Sweaty, crude, necessary. There were whispers among the dockworkers of Bleeding House, a nickname for one particular merchant villa where the wealth flowed so freely that some swore it came not from ships, but from something darker, an old superstition, not taken seriously by most. But interesting, isn't it, how even the most luxurious places can attract ghost stories? And there were real ghosts, in a sense. The names of ships lost at sea, never spoken aloud inside these villas but kept on parchment, filed under, unclaimed, delayed, or simply missing. The names of crewmen who had vanished with them often reduced to initials, or worse, listed only as hired hand. Their wages forfeited, their bodies never recovered. The Empire had no ceremony for them, no day of mourning, no hymn, just a gap in the records and a space on the bench at the next feast. Meanwhile, the children of the villa played in corridors lined with tiles, their laughter echoing off high, whitewashed ceilings. They reenacted great conquests using carved soldiers, built forts out of pillows, and tossed gold-painted coins into bowls as part of imaginary merchant deals. They learned early to speak of the Indies not as a place, but as an idea. A source of endless things, spices, wood, glory. They would inherit this rhythm, this silence, and these same heavy keys to chests that clicked open with a sound everyone in the household recognized without looking. And when night came, and the doors were locked, and the courtyard grew cool again, the household drifted into its separate quarters, the master to his study, the lady to her embroidery, the servants to their straw pallets behind the kitchen wall. There was peace of a kind, but it was the peace of wealth built on noise happening elsewhere, across the sea, below deck. Beyond the map, Seville, for all its splendor, pulsed quietly with unease. It was the center of something too large to see fully. A city whose fountains flowed while its ships vanished into storms. A place where banquets marked success and silence marked loss. And as you rest now, you might imagine the villa at midnight. The coals in the hearth have gone soft. The wine is low. Outside, a dog barks once, then falls quiet. The wind stirs the orange trees. And in a narrow chamber on the second floor, a young merchant heir lies awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering briefly what it might feel like to hold an oar in his hands instead of a goblet. Chapter 5. Bleeding, leeches, and shipboard surgery. Far from the tiled courtyards of Seville, beneath sagging sails and the creaking ribs of wooden ships, there was another kind of chamber. It held no books, no linen, no scent of lavender. Instead, it smelled of sweat, old wine, iron, and rot. This was the barber-surgeon's corner, and always a cloth rarely clean to mop what could not be stopped. But aboard a ship with no real fresh air and endless moisture, small things became dangerous quickly. A fever wasn't just a fever. It could be scurvy or dysentery or the early sign of something worse. The crew didn't ask for diagnoses. He moved like someone in constant negotiation with death, sometimes winning, often stalling. His tools were wrapped in cloth, tucked into leather rolls stained dark over years of service. He was not feared, exactly. But when he approached with his pouch, men instinctively looked away. A broken finger set properly. A tooth pulled cleanly, followed by real relief. A man with a deep gash in his thigh who recovered slowly, each stitch holding firm as the ship rolled. It was done with ritual, a cloth to catch the blood. Boiled vinegar, if lucky, salt water, if not. A thread pulled from the hem of a shirt, a needle borrowed from a salve maker. Bandages made from torn linens, washed and reused until they barely held shape. The body would be wrapped and cast overboard, often with a few quiet words and whatever coins he still had in his pouch. No graves, no markers, only the sea, wide and forgetful. There were no antiseptics, no gloves, no clean rooms, just intention and repetition. He worked alone usually, unless a cabin boy or cook was brave or unlucky enough to be called to hold a limb steady. A man bent over a crude table, his hands steady, his eyes unreadable. He does not see you watching. He is busy saving something. Not a life, perhaps, but a moment of comfort, a breath, a second chance. The only surgery that matters when the world is made of water and wood, a whispered phrase. A look exchanged that said, "Let this be enough." Most of the time, it wasn't, but the process gave the illusion of control. And sometimes belief is its own balm. These small victories were celebrated not with cheers, but with nods, with a cup of broth, with the simple return of duty. A sailor with a shattered knee who learned to limp with a carved cane. A cook who lost 3 fingers but taught himself to stir with his elbow. A boy whose back bore the stripes of illness, but lived long enough to see Seville again. They were changed, of course, not just physically, but changed in a way that made silence deeper and laughter softer. They had seen too much to ever speak plainly again. Back to the oars. Back to the ropes. No medals. Just survival. If the maestro comes near, bite your own tongue off first, they'd mutter. Or, I'd rather kiss the cannon's mouth than his saw. But when illness came, they still went to him. Not out of trust, but because there was no one else. They just hoped not to be noticed. Maybe a bite of leather or cloth to muffle the cries, and then the saw. No hesitation, no ceremony. The quicker, the better. Pain was inevitable. The goal was speed. Bleeding was sometimes staunched with hot tar, poured directly onto the wound while the patient thrashed and moaned. The smell was unmistakable, burnt flesh and pine. Kept in jars, fed occasionally with scraps of meat, they were applied to swollen limbs or reddened joints. The idea was simple. Draw out the bad blood. Did it work? Hard to say. But when you're desperate, even the wriggling comfort of a parasite feels like medicine. Sailors gave the leeches names. One man swore his leech saved him twice. Another insisted his had a bad attitude and was stealing more than just blood. There were no anesthetics, no sterilization, no concept yet of germs or infection. The surgeon always claimed he'd done what he could. No one argued what else could be done. Prayer was the only follow-up care. There was only urgency, luck, and the patient's ability to scream quietly. And if you ended up here, you were already unlucky. There was no designated infirmary aboard a 16th-century Spanish galleon. Space was too precious. Wounded men were treated wherever there room near the galley, against the bulkhead, sometimes even on a barrel with no cot could be cleared. The man in charge was rarely a physician in a modern sense. He was often a trained barber who had learned surgery from someone else who had learned it from another man, possibly under the flickering light of a tavern lamp. His tools were simple. A saw, a curved blade, a clamp, a thread, sometimes leeches, a bowl for blood, a jug for rum. It usually began with something small. A splinter driven deep into the palm, a blister turned abscess, a toothache that radiated up the jaw. Wounds were common. A slipped blade in the galley, a rope burn gone raw, a barrel rolled the wrong way during a storm and shattered a leg. And when battle came, if it came, injuries turned grisly in seconds. Splinters from shattered decks, cannonballs tearing through multiple men, limbs crushed beneath fallen rigging. There was no time for reflection. The wounded were carried or dragged, and if they could not stand, they were laid down wherever space allowed. The barber surgeon was called simply maestro, though few said it with affection. If a limb had to be taken, and it did, often the process was crude. A makeshift tourniquet above the wound. A few splashes of rum. Some didn't survive the cutting. Some did, only to die days later of fever, of rot, of wounds that refused to close. And yet, there were moments, strange, quiet moments when healing actually happened. The leeches were the most talked about, perhaps because they were the most visible. There was also bleeding with blades, a deliberate cut at the temple or wrist, meant to let the sickness escape. The surgeon worked with what he had. In all this, the crew found ways to joke. Gallows humor, mostly. Death was frequent, but rarely dramatic. A man would stop eating, then sleeping, then speaking. And eventually he would simply not rise, and yet some survived things no one expected. As you rest now, imagine that quiet space near the stern. A single lantern swinging gently. Though most aboard the ship called him simply the barber, his full role stretched far beyond the trimming of hair or the pulling of bad teeth. On any long voyage, he became the reluctant custodian of pain. And though he was rarely thanked, it was often his hands that decided whether a sailor returned home in one piece or not at all. Some barbers came prepared, having served on multiple ships, their fingers calloused from years of clumsy stitching and hurried amputations. Others were land-bound tradesmen, hired for their shaving skills and suddenly thrown into the sea's deeper demands. Those were the ones who learned by doing, who developed their methods through trial and unfortunate error. Every man wondered if the fever would reach him next. A storm might strike and pass in silence. A bird might land, observe the men below, and leave without song. Superstition crept in, fed by fatigue. Sailors blamed the deaths on cursed cargo, on forgotten rituals, on a lack of proper prayers before departure. One man threw his boots overboard, claiming they carried bad spirits. Another burned his shirt and refused to speak for 2 days. The surgeon didn't talk about home. If he had one, no one knew where it was. It's a strange compliment, but a fair one. For a surgeon on a galleon, the job wasn't about saving everyone. It was about stopping the worst from becoming the only outcome, about giving pain a pathway. And maybe, if luck allowed, giving one more sailor the chance to stand on solid land again. He didn't laugh at jokes. He didn't play dice. Valuables collected. Last words recorded if there were any. Some surgeons refused this duty. Others accepted it with quiet solemnity. They knew the sea had no grave markers, only memory. And even that faded fast. He ate alone, often in the corner nearest the storage crates. Some speculated he kept journals tucked into the seams of his chest, filled with drawings of the things he couldn't say out loud. But no one ever saw them. They began sleeping farther apart, keeping personal charms beneath their shirts, refusing certain foods, avoiding certain corners of the ship. The air felt thicker, the sea somehow more still. If they were lucky, they survived long enough to develop a system. The ocean is calm. The crew still sleeps. And in the belly of the ship, the surgeon sits alone beside a bundle wrapped in cloth. He does not weep, he does not speak. He simply waits for the moment when the sea takes what remains, and the day begins again. Watched how he handled the blade, how he wrapped cloth, how he responded to groans, flinches, and final breaths. They watched because they knew that sooner or later, it might be their turn. They wanted to know who would be standing over them when their body failed. If they weren't, their patients didn't either. Without question. And if his work was sometimes futile, it was also necessary. He cleaned wounds, bandaged limbs, drained sores, set broken fingers, and once, according to one account, helped deliver a baby born prematurely to a woman disguised as a sailor. No record exists of what became of the child, or the woman. Just a note in the log, infant delivered, strong lungs, hidden until port. Records from the era mention very little about these men by name. These felt like luxuries, reminders that not every problem required rum, restraint, and a prayer. He would pull up a stool, gesture the man to sit, and for a few minutes, play the role he had originally trained for, the quiet, competent man who made others more presentable. He might trim a beard, wash a wound with rose water, or wrap a wrist with careful care. And for those moments, he was not the harbinger of pain, but something softer, almost a comfort. Histories focus on captains and conquerors, but in the pages of old ship logs, you can still find their work brief notations scrawled beside names, often marked with small crosses or the word reduced. A sailor's name followed by abscess lanced, or leg removed above the knee, or more simply, expired under treatment. The barber's chest was often his most valuable possession. A wooden box lined with straps to hold blades, jars, and powders. Inside you might find dried herbs, collected from Port's rosemary for infection, valerian for nerves. Some barbers carried bezoar stones, believed to counter poison, and powdered coral, used to stop bleeding. Faith mingled with superstition, and every man had his preferred remedies. Some swore by tobacco juice rubbed into wounds. Others carried dried orange peels as protection against fevers. Whether these worked or not hardly mattered. The leaf was as strong a medicine as anything. Sometimes the greatest danger wasn't wounds, but disease. Fever spread fast in cramped quarters. A single cough could echo down a hallway and return the next morning as 3 more. The crew recognized the signs long before the surgeon did. Reddened eyes, a slowness in movement, a muttering of nonsense. Those who showed symptoms were quietly moved away, given a barrel's width of space. A blanket if one could be spared, and little else. The surgeon would come, sit beside them, touch the forehead, nod once, and offer whatever or liquids remained. He might whisper a prayer, but he would not promise hope. During these times, the crew grew quieter. Meals were taken quickly. Jokes stopped. Laughter became cautious. There were moments when the ship itself seemed to mourn. Still, the surgeon remained a fixture. He tended without judgment. In rare moments of calm, the surgeon found himself treating small, almost laughable things. A sprained wrist, an ingrown nail, a cracked molar. The crew never spoke to him much, but they watched him. There were no official uniforms, no crisp white coats. Just a stained apron, a few pouches tied to a belt, and a 1,000-yard stare that had seen too much. One sailor, much later, described the surgeon he sailed with as a man who carried death in his hands, and did his best not to let it fall. Even after death, the surgeon's work continued. Bodies had to be wrapped. As you drift off now, imagine the ship at dawn. Chapter 6. Smuggling, Stowaways, and Secret Cargo. Not everything aboard a Spanish galleon was listed on the manifest. For every sack of cow, every chest of silver, and every bolt of sanctioned fabric, there was always something else. Something quiet. Unwritten. Hidden in crates of olives, or sewn into the hems of cloaks, or curled tightly inside a sailor's bedroll. You might think of these as footnotes to empire, but they were more than that. They were the true cargo of men who lived between the lines. Officially, the Spanish crown controlled all movement of goods from the New World. Nothing could be loaded, shipped, or unloaded without royal oversight. Taxes were levied. Permissions were issued. Ledgers were inspected twice once before departure and again upon arrival. The system was complex, detailed, and ambitious. It was also porous. Wherever rules are written, someone finds a way around them. And the sea, with its endless hiding places and changing crews, made an ideal accomplice. Smuggling wasn't always grand or dangerous. Sometimes it was as simple as a sailor pocketing a few pearls from a coastal market, or a crate marked sugar that contained a bundle of rare spices folded inside a damp cloth. A navigator might agree to carry a small package for a merchant cousin, no questions asked. A priest might tuck a few forbidden texts into the lining of his trunk, believing they would be safer in Europe than in colonial hands. Some smuggled for profit, others for ideology. Most did it for both. The lower holds of the ship, stacked high with sanctioned cargo, were also perfect places to hide things. A box of candied fruit with a false bottom. A barrel of oil that held not just liquid, but letters, sealed in wax and wrapped in pigskin. There were compartments beneath deckboards, slits carved into the sides of crates. Even the beams themselves, hollowed out over years by clever carpenters who never wrote down their secrets. And the men who kept these secrets did not advertise. Smuggling was a quiet art. A man did not boast about what he carried. He did not wink when the barrels shifted strangely. He kept his eyes on the horizon and his words few. The best smugglers were the ones who seemed incapable of lying because they rarely spoke at all, but there were others. Risk-takers. Men who loaded their personal gear with contraband and simply hoped the inspections would be distracted. They built relationships with officers, shared wine, told jokes, slipped coins where coins shouldn't go. And when it worked, they landed in Seville with enough rare tobacco or cut gems to turn a month's wage into a year's comfort. Of course, when it didn't work, when someone was caught, the punishment was swift. Confiscation, flogging, imprisonment. Sometimes worse. The crown did not like being cheated, especially not by those meant to carry its glory across the seas. And yet, no matter how many were punished, the practice never stopped. It was too easy, too tempting, too embedded. Stowaways were rare, but they happened. A boy clinging to the underside of a loading ramp. A runaway servant who slipped into a shipment of linens. A young woman dressed in a sailor's tunic, silent and small, hoping the sea would carry her away from something worse on land. Some were caught before the sails unfurled. Others made it to open water, only to be discovered when rations ran short or a hidden cough echoed too loudly in the dark. What happened next varied. Sometimes the captain was lenient, especially if space allowed. A stowaway might be put to work scrubbing decks, hauling rope, fetching water. They would eat last and sleep least, but they would survive. In rare cases, they were even accepted, folded into the crew like any other sailor, their pasts ignored, their futures unspoken. Other times the rules were less kind. A stowaway might be locked in the hold, chained near the pigs, or placed under constant watch. There were stories, some true, some whispered, of stowaways tossed into the sea during storms, when food ran low or tempers ran high. Not often, but enough to make the others look twice before offering help. Still, some stowaways were more than refugees. Some were spies, messengers, smugglers themselves, sent aboard to keep watch on a particular crate or to intercept a particular letter. These were the most dangerous, not because they wielded weapons, but because they wielded information. A name overheard, a seal broken, a map copied and returned before morning. They moved between shadows, and they never stayed long in the same hammock twice. It wasn't only individuals who hid secrets aboard. Entire crates were sometimes false. One such case was recorded near Cartagena, where a shipment of tools was loaded under royal seal. The captain, curious, had one opened mid-voyage. Inside were not hammers and chisels, but bound captives and slave persons hidden for private sale, bypassing official markets. The captain turned a blind eye. The crates reached Havana. The names were never recorded. There were other kinds of secret cargo. Religious items not approved by the church. Writings considered heretical. Art stolen from local temples. Bones taken from ancient graves, believed to carry power. One crew told of a small idol wrapped in cloth, taken from a ruined city deep in the jungle. No one would admit to carrying it. Yet it kept appearing on the main deck and the galley, even once in the captain's quarters. Eventually, it was thrown overboard. The next day, the wind changed, and a storm struck. The crew said nothing, but no one ever spoke of the idol again. These stories swirled through every voyage, some real, some cautionary, all shared in hushed voices during night watch, when the stars blinked down and the sails flapped like lungs overhead. You might wonder how much was true. But in the half-light of memory, truth often wears the mask of rumor. And sometimes it is the things we cannot verify that stay with us longest. Imagine it now. You're in the lower hold. The lantern flickers. Crates creak around you. The ship sways gently. And somewhere not far off, something shifts. A sound too soft to be cargo. A breath too human to be wind. You stay still. You say nothing. Because aboard a ship like this, what you pretend not to see can't be used against you later. While the main deck buzzed with orders and sunlight, it was in the shadows between crates, beneath floorboards, and behind false panels that the ship's second story unfolded. Some called it survival, others called it theft. The Crown called it treason. But for those living week to week on briny stew and stale bread, it was simply a way to leave the voyage with something more than bruises and salt-dried skin. A galleon was a floating marketplace. Some crewmen brought wares from home buttons, lace, small knives, beads carved from olive wood. These could be traded at colonial ports for strange fruits, feathers, tobacco, or information. Bottles of wine marked for mass, but enjoyed after hours, passed between hands like hot coals, their contents unknown but urgent. Officially, everyone aboard a galleon was accounted for. But unofficially, things got hazy. A local guide invited aboard at the last minute, a nobleman's cousin traveling incognito. A woman dressed as a boy, claiming to be a page. These passengers rarely appeared on rosters. They lived in borrowed hammocks, ate when others looked away, disembarked quickly, without farewell. Others arrived in crates of grain, their presence not revealed until sacks moved of their own accord. Footsteps heard in the lower hold when no one was below. A crate that changed position overnight. These oddities were explained away. Always. Sleepwalking, loose knots, imagination. Not because they were greedy. Always, but because they were human. They wanted more than just salt pork and backbreaking work. They wanted insurance, a future, a secret worth keeping. And somewhere, tucked behind a crate marked dried beans, there is a box. Not listed, not opened, not yet. But on long voyages, when time unraveled and days bled into nights, the crew grew sensitive to change. One missing object could turn into a story. One unexplained knock might become a warning. In one curious tale, a sailor claimed a rat on his ship wore a tiny copper ring on its tail. No one believed him until another man swore he saw it too. Days later, disappearing into a wall with something shiny in its mouth. Some bore wax seals. Others were folded into tight triangles, corners blackened to discourage tampering. Most were written in ink that faded quickly in sunlight. There was no running to shore, no reporting to a higher authority. The ship was its own country, its own law, and within that floating world, justice was whatever the captain could enforce, and silence was its own survival tool. Some were addressed to lovers, others to merchants. A few to no one at all coded messages meant for the wrong eyes. One letter, found years later tucked into a book of saints, simply read, "He knows. Tell no one. Burn this." There was no name, no sender. In one case, a missionary carried a scroll written in Hebrew, hidden within a flute. He claimed it was for translation. Others suspected it was something else entirely. One day, he was simply there sharing a deckhand's bowl, sleeping beside the pigs. He never gave a full name, spoke little, but he fixed nets with a precision that made others look twice. Helped navigate by stars, though he claimed never to have studied them. Some said he was running from a duel. Others believed he was sent to observe the ship. He vanished one night before port. No one saw him go. But when a crate of ivory disappeared the same night, the two events became forever linked in whispers. He refused to play the flute even when asked. It had been inspected mid-voyage and signed off. What it once held was never determined. Another barrel arrived sealed with 3 different kinds of wax. Inside were textiles from the East, carefully wrapped in plain brown cloth, each one bearing tiny stitched symbols along the edge. No merchant claimed them. They were auctioned quietly. The buyer? A man who never gave his name and paid in coin no one recognized. A man who overheard a deal made in a hold might receive a favor to keep it to himself, a ration doubled. Some ignored it if the crew worked hard and stayed quiet. Others took a cut, discreetly. A pouch placed outside their cabin door, a sealed letter they never opened. It was a dance delicate and necessary. Too strict, and the crew might grow resentful. Too lax, and the ship could attract the wrong attention at port. The trick was balance. A lookout cupboard, or a share of the spoils when they reached land. Secrets were currency. You didn't need to hide anything yourself to benefit from something hidden. Just knowing who carried what was sometimes enough to make the voyage a little more comfortable. A sailor with good timing might sell his belt for a smoked fish, or a torn page of a psalm book for a carved charm said to keep storms away. Officially, such trades were frowned upon. Unofficially, they kept morale steady and pockets slightly heavier. There was also a market for silence. Captains weren't blind. Most had learned over time that a certain amount of smuggling was inevitable. Even priests aboard had their secrets. A crucifix hollowed out to store relics, and there were the letters. Always the letters. Then there were the passengers who were not quite passengers. One such figure was known only as Diego. No one knew where he boarded. The cargo itself sometimes told stories. In one case, a crate marked glassware arrived in Seville, completely empty. No shards, no straw, nothing. Even more mysterious were the things no one packed. Rats, for instance. Every galleon had them. But some came from other ships, sneaking aboard in the dark. Other stowaways were less tangible, a smell that came and went. And always the sea surrounded it all, wide, indifferent. Despite the risks, men continued to smuggle. They continued to hide things in barrels, sew coins into their collars, carry messages on scraps of silk inside their boots. As the ship rolled gently through a darkening sea, those secrets shifted in their hiding places, unseen, unspoken, waiting to be discovered. Or never. And as you drift now, eye soft and breath slow, imagine a quiet space in the cargo hold. The lantern is low. The floor creaks just once. Chapter 7. The Manila Galleon Trade and Silent Slaves of the Sea, Segment 1. Every year. Like clockwork tuned to the rhythms of empire, a Spanish galleon set sail across the vastness of the Pacific. from Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco on the western shores of New Spain. The route was long, treacherous, and unimaginably lucrative. It was known simply as the Manila Galleon trade, and for over 250 years, it became one of the most remarkable and yet strangely quiet arteries of global commerce. To picture the voyage, you must first unlearn what you know of oceans. This was not the brisk Atlantic route of European conquest, or the coastal voyages of early explorers. This was the open Pacific, a yawning canvas of water, wider than any mind could truly grasp. A journey not of days, but of months. The galleon would leave Manila loaded with silk, spices, porcelain, lacquerware, and perfumes, all riches of the East. These goods were destined not just for the Americas, but eventually through redistribution, for Europe itself. In return, silver flowed back from the New World to Asia, coins, bars, and slivers of ore, the bloodstream of empire running in quiet loops across oceans. But behind this elegant exchange, hidden between bolts of silk and boxes of cinnamon, were people, not passengers. Not officers, workers, servants. Some were registered. Many were not. They were listed, when listed at all, as cargo assistants or personal servants. Their names rarely made it into ship logs, yet their labor was essential. In Manila, enslaved people were gathered from all corners of the Spanish East Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines itself, and even coastal India. Some had been born into bondage. Others had been taken in war, sold by rival groups, or captured as punishment. A few, notably, had once been freemen, merchants, farmers, or fishermen who had been tricked or betrayed, then passed into hands that recorded them only by height and price. They were loaded onto ships in the early morning, before the city stirred. Often barefoot, sometimes in chains, sometimes simply led in silence. They did not occupy cabins. They were kept in low compartments near the keel, where cargo sweat seeped into the boards and air moved poorly, if at all. They slept sitting up or not at all. They were given food meant for animals, rice gruel, dried fish, the occasional bruised fruit. When storms hit, they were sometimes lashed to beams to prevent them from rolling. And when sickness spread, they were the first to be blamed and the last to be treated. Their jobs were many: hauling crates, cooking, cleaning, mending sails, emptying chamber pots. Some served officers directly, washing their clothing and preparing their meals. Others worked in the galley, standing for hours over smoky stoves, their eyes watering, their feet raw. They carried messages between decks, held lanterns during midnight repairs, scrubbed the decks with salt and sand until their knuckles bled. And all of it, always in silence. The silence was not just absence of speech, it was enforced. Many did not speak Spanish. Those who did were discouraged from using it outside of service. Eye contact with officers was punished. Movement outside of assigned zones was considered disobedience. And the rules shifted with the moods of those in charge. One day, a gesture might be overlooked. The next, it might earn a blow. There was no protection, legal or otherwise. The galleon was a sovereign space, and once at sea, law belonged to the captain and God, and not necessarily in that order. Complaints were meaningless. Appeals for kindness were rare. Survival depended on invisibility, on anticipation, on learning which steps creaked, which faces to avoid, and which jobs were most likely to offer a scrap of extra food or a moment of rest. Some enslaved people formed quiet alliances. A nod passed between workers below deck. A shared bowl of rice, a warning about a bad mood brewing topside. These small gestures became lifelines. Human contact in a space designed to erase personhood. A reminder that even in captivity, people find ways to hold on to themselves. Escape was impossible at sea. But resistance took other forms. A meal prepared slightly wrong. A nail not fully driven. A whispered story passed from one laborer to the next, reminding them who they were before this voyage began. These were not acts of rebellion in the traditional sense, but they were quiet refusals to disappear entirely. Not all officers were cruel. Some, though rare, treated their servants with a measure of respect, acknowledged their labor, provided extra food or blankets during cold nights. But even this kindness existed within a broken framework. Even the gentlest master still held the whip. And no amount of generosity could undo the fact that these people had been taken, traded, and made tools of a system that saw them as less than human. Sometimes a laborer would die. Quietly. No ceremony. Their body wrapped in burlap or not at all. They would be tipped into the sea at dawn without a name spoken. The water would close, indifferent, and the ship would move on. Back in Manila, their absence might not be noticed. No letters would be sent, no family informed. And in Seville, where the silks were unpacked and the silver counted, no one asked how many had come aboard in the first place. At the ports, the galleons were celebrated for their cargo. When a ship returned to Acapulco with porcelain and silk, the city bloomed like a fairground. Merchants arrived from across New Spain to inspect the crates, haggle over bolts of patterned cloth, and claim contracts for items that would never touch their own hands. The goods that survived the long voyage fetched enormous sums. A single crate of Chinese tea or lacquerware could buy a townhouse. The crowd cheered the arrival of the ship. Trumpets played. Prayers were offered. But no one asked how many lives were lost to bring it there. The enslaved workers who disembarked, if they did at all, did so quietly. Some were claimed by their owners and taken inland. Others were sold immediately at the dock, unrecorded, unprotected, and unremarked. A few were taken back across the ocean to Spain. Their journey, already impossibly long, extended again across unfamiliar lands. It is difficult to know what became of them. The records are incomplete. Often, they are little more than a name, a value, a vague origin, Malay, Moro, Tagalog, Lascar, and then nothing. Some of these individuals became personal attendants in wealthy Spanish homes. They lit candles, served meat, and stood beside noble women at mass. Dressed in livery, they appeared in paintings as background figures, part of the furniture of status. Their faces were recorded in oils, but not their stories. Their clothing was altered to match their master's taste, their hair trimmed or covered, their names changed entirely. What they remembered of their old lives, they kept inside. Yet even in these distant places, fragments of their identity persisted. A lullaby hummed under breath. A prayer said in a native tongue. A dish prepared using remembered spices, even when the ingredients were not quite right. These quiet inheritances endured, carried not in books or monuments, but in habits, in memory. In silence, back on the ships, the system endured. The Manila Galleon was not a one-time experiment, but a cycle repeating, reshaping, reinforcing. Each year, a new vessel left the Philippines with a new crew, a new load, and new names never meant to be remembered. The voyage took 5 months westward, sometimes more. The return leg, aided by the trade winds, could be shorter, but the damage was cumulative. Men aged fast. Laborers arrived ash-colored and hollow-eyed, and every successful journey only deepened the belief that this was all sustainable, that profit could excuse anything. The physical structure of the galleon itself reflected this hidden system. The space for cargo was vast, but human quarters were narrow, sloped, and often deliberately separated. The air flowed poorly. Rats lived in the seams of the ship, thriving on crumbs and despair. The enslaved passengers were rarely allowed above deck, except during cleaning hours or in emergencies. Sunlight was rationed like water. And yet, beneath the harshness, there were stories, glimpses. One tale speaks of a young boy from the Visayas who learned to copy the navigator's star charts by watching from a distance. By the end of the voyage, he could name the constellations in both his own language and Castilian. Another tells of a girl who stitched poems into the hem of her tunic using threads pulled from sailcloth. Her verses were discovered years later, tucked into the pages of a merchant's journal, never attributed. There were also acts of mercy. A cook who saved an extra piece of fruit each night. A sailor who slipped a pair of boots to a barefoot worker before disembarkation. These were small kindnesses. Insufficient, certainly, but not meaningless. They reminded both giver and receiver that cruelty was not the only choice available aboard a ship built for exploitation. The Manila Galleon was more than a ship. It was a corridor between worlds, east and west, enslaved and free, known and unknowable. It carried goods, yes, but also languages, beliefs, diseases, music, and lives in transit. And with it came contradictions. It was a marvel of navigation and a mechanism of suffering. It stitched continents together and unraveled families. It brought wealth to empires and silence to countless mouths. In time, the trade faded. Political shifts, naval innovations, and colonial unrest made the route less viable. The final galleon sailed in 1815, its decks loaded with the last sanctioned treasures of a dying system. But even after the sails were lowered, the legacy remained. In the DNA of port cities, in the shared vocabulary of colonial languages, in the faces of people who bore traces of both origin and journey. Today, if you walk through certain neighborhoods in Mexico, the Philippines, or Spain, you might pass descendants of those who sailed without names. You would not know them by sight. Their stories were not written in marble, but they exist in the cooking pots, in the rhythms of speech, in the quiet habits of remembering without being told. As you drift now into rest, picture one last image. The galleon at sea, slicing across a starlit Pacific, the sails full, the wood groaning softly. And deep below, in the quiet hold, a man stirs. He does not speak, but he remembers a song. And in the darkness, beneath silk and silver, he sings it softly to himself, just once so the sea knows he was there. Chapter 8. Star Charts and Nightmares of the Deep. Night came slowly at sea. First, the edges of the sky dulled to gray. Decorative. Something you notice on a clear evening and forget by morning. But for the sailors aboard a 16th century Spanish galleon, the stars were not just companions. They were guides, clocks, and sometimes warnings. When all else failed, when the compass wobbled and the wind spun in circles, the stars remained steady, ancient, indifferent. Then the wind quieted, the waves softened, and the creak of the sails took on a new tone, more rhythm than sound. Lanterns were lit, one by one, casting a dim amber glow across the decks. The groan of wood bending in ways it shouldn't. Some of it was natural plank strain. Phosphorescent algae, the moan of wind caught in rope. A galleon, not unlike their own, but darker. Quieter. Her sails didn't flap, though the wind was strong. Her lanterns were lit, but no crew could be seen. The watchman called out. No answer. The captain fired a warning shot. The ship did not react. And then, just as quickly as she had come, she disappeared. One man swore he saw a figure rise from the sea, walk the length of the deck, and vanish near the stern. Never say the word drowned on night watch. Don't light a second lantern after midnight. The rules made no sense, but they were followed. Superstition isn't about logic. It's about comfort. He never worked night watch again. Another said he heard singing in a language he did not know, soft and close, as if someone were crouched just behind his ear. Some said it was a mirage. Others said it was a ghost ship, one that sailed forever between worlds, crewed by men who had disobeyed the sea. But not all. Or at least not all that could be explained in the moment. The weight of too many nights too far from land. The sea swelled inside, and in the quiet, a man might look up and see a single point of light constant, familiar, and feel, just for a moment, that he was not entirely lost. Men could lose themselves out here, forget their names, speak to shadows, hear voices in the creak of rope. Sleep became fragile, time became liquid, and everyone, even the most skeptical, had at least one moment, one flicker in the night, when the known world seemed to slip just slightly out of reach. A false reading could send a ship miles off course. A misaligned compass, undetected for a day, could doom an entire journey. That's why some captains carried multiple charts. Different versions. Not because they were unreliable, but because they didn't trust a single truth in a world so determined to shift underfoot. The world above was swallowed in darkness. And with it came the stars. The sounds of the sea filtered down, the slap of waves, the sigh of wood, the occasional groan that it didn't match any known motion. Some men slept with charms tucked beneath their shirts, a St. Christopher medal, a knotted ribbon, a small wooden carving worn smooth by touch. Others lay with eyes open, watching nothing, hoping their turn on deck would not bring anything they could not explain. To modern eyes, stars are background. The pilot, often hunched over a table nailed down in the chart house, used them to calculate position. Latitude could be estimated by measuring the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, if the clouds allowed. Longitude, elusive and frustrating, remained more art than science, guessed by dead reckoning and a sense of the ship's speed. Every journey was part calculation, part memory, and part blind faith, fear, not of the stars, but of what they revealed. The ocean at night was a kind of mirror, vast, black, reflecting a world too big to hold. Some men refused to look directly into it, claiming that to stare too long was to invite madness. Others believed the sea had eyes, that somewhere beneath the ship, something watched. Each night, the watch changed hands. The crew rotated in and out of sleep, climbing ladders with heavy limbs, their breath steaming in the cold. Up on deck, wrapped in wool and oilcloth, the night watchmen stood at their posts. Tales that mixed faith and fear passed between sailors like charms. The Southern Cross meant good luck. Orion's belt pointed home. The Dog Star warned of storms. These beliefs weren't written in any official logbook, but they lived in whispers, tucked between yawns and murmured prayers. Some leaned against masts, others paced, and all of them watched the sky, if only to keep their minds from wandering too far into thought. The stars, they believed, told stories, not just the patterns taught in navigational training, but older stories. But for every sailor who found comfort in the night sky, there were others who found something else. Strange things happened on night watch. Lights on the horizon that vanished before you could blink. Shapes in the water that made no splash. There was the tale of a ship that appeared off the port bow during a fog-drenched night. These weren't official stories. You wouldn't find them in logs or church reports. But everyone knew them. Even the stars themselves could deceive. Cloud cover might part for a moment, reveal a constellation, and then swallow it again. Beneath the deck, sailors dreamt restlessly. A few refused night duty altogether, claimed illness, took lashings for dereliction, better pain than panic. These stories spread, changed shape, became warnings. Don't whistle at sea, they'd say. It calls something up from below. The most experienced sailors said the true fear was not what might climb aboard, but what might rise within. Isolation, imagination. And yet, the Galleon sailed on, every night, every watch. The stars wheeled overhead. It's easy to think of fear as something loud screaming, panicking, thrashing. But the fear that lived aboard a galleon was often quiet. It crept in slowly, not like a sudden storm, but more like the tide. On especially calm nights, when the water stilled to glass, the crew grew restless. They called it the hush. The sails hung slack. The rigging didn't groan. The usual hum of movement disappeared. It was as if the ocean had paused, waiting for something. Another might say he dreamt of standing on a shoreline he didn't recognize, with sand that stuck like ash. The strangest part was how similar the dreams became. Their maps curled at the edges, their compasses flawed by rust and magnetic oddities. It was a form of poetry, written across the sky. When Navigator died, his notes were either kept for reference or quietly burned, especially if they hinted at mental strain. A chart tainted with madness could not be trusted. Better to start fresh. Better to forget. And once a man was gone, he was gone completely. No funeral, no grave, just a name crossed out in the log. If he had family, they might never hear. The stars brilliant and clear, the wind soft and steady. The ship moving gently through a sea like silk. On those nights, even the most hardened crewman might pause. Imagine the ship moving steadily beneath a sky full of constellations. The ropes creak, the lantern swings gently, and up on the quarterdeck, a lone watchman hums a tune no one taught him. A melody caught from the waves, a lullaby for the deep. Lean on the rail, watch the constellations slide across the heavens. Think of someone far away, a wife, a child, a village that hadn't seen sails in years. If he owed money, his debt died with him. The sea, though vast, felt like a cradle rather than a grave. And the ship, so vulnerable by day, became a sanctuary under the stars. A place apart from war, from judgment, from anything but the rhythm of breath and water and wind. The sea, it seemed, did not believe in closure. Many navigators kept journals, not just of coordinates, but of their thoughts. Short entries. One wrote, "Saw the tail of Leo tonight. First time in weeks, felt like seeing an old friend." Another scribbled, "Dreamed of home again, smelled bread, woke up to mildew." They were expected to know where they were, even when the sea offered no hint. Some had tricks hollowed bones for measuring speed, candle clocks, or makeshift sextants carved from driftwood. It happened more than anyone liked to admit. A wave, a misstep, a snapped rope. One moment, a sailor was beside you. The next, gone. No splash, no cry. Just a shape in the water that vanished before you could even react. At night, it was worse. You couldn't see where the body landed. You only heard the commotion, the shout, the sudden scramble toward the rail. By the time the lanterns arrived, it was over. But ultimately, they worked with guesswork and prayer. A single miscalculation could steer the ship into a reef, a current of days of empty blue. Different men, different languages, all dreaming of the same things, vast underwater caverns, voices calling from beneath the waves, a pull in the chest as if something was trying to drag them overboard. Even the animals changed. No flying fish, no gulls, just a blank, moonlit mirror beneath a sky filled with silent stars. Some men said the hush came before bad luck. Others believed it marked the passing of a soul. You didn't notice it rising until you were already knee-deep. Others refused to approach the edge of the deck after dark. A few carried knives in case they were ever caught in a net or dragged by accident, but most simply accepted the risk. You lived with it, like the cold, like the hunger, like the fear. He thought it was another vessel's lantern, bobbing in the dark. But as the crew gathered on deck to see, they realized it was something else, blue-green lights, low in the water, moving in patterns too smooth, too alive. Bioluminescence, perhaps, or jellyfish, or something older. The lights hovered, pulsed, and then slowly faded into blackness. No one spoke for the rest of the watch. And at night, with only the stars to measure time and no land in sight for weeks, even the bravest men found themselves asking questions they would never dare speak aloud. Sometimes it was the sea itself that stirred unease. That after too long at sea, the Galleon began to affect its crew not with poison or sickness, but with suggestion. A subtle warping of thoughts until men could no longer tell the difference between story and memory. After all, how many nights could you spend staring into black water without starting to see things that weren't there? Once, in the middle of such a night, the ship's lookout spotted a flicker in the waves. Then there were the dreams. They arrived gradually. One sailor might mention waking with a start, unsure why. It was probably coincidence. Sleep-deprived minds filling in blanks. But some believed the ship itself was the cause. The navigators, too, bore their share of burden. And yet there was beauty in their craft. Watching the stars, tracking their slow movement, aligning the ship to their cold, predictable rhythm. These journals were rarely read by others. And then there was the fear of going overboard. There were no rescue boats in those moments, no diving teams. The sea claimed quickly. Some men tied ropes around their waists when working at night. Still, not all fear was founded. Sometimes the night was kind. In those moments, time felt slower, the world smaller. The dangers distant. As you rest now, let yourself drift into that quiet. Chapter 9. Punishment at Sea. Keel hauling and the lash. Life aboard a Spanish galleon was governed by wind, tide, and command. And where command faltered, discipline took its place. A floating society has few options for justice. There were no courts out at sea, no juries, no appeals. Only the captain's voice, the boatswain's arm, and a series of punishments designed less to rehabilitate than to remind. Order, once disturbed, had to be reasserted visibly. sharply, and for all to witness. Most punishments were swift and physical. A missed chore, a disrespectful glance, a whispered complaint overheard by the wrong person. These didn't lead to execution, but they didn't go unnoticed either. The lash was the most common remedy. Leather cords tied to a wooden handle, often embedded with knots or stiffened by salt. The sailor receiving it would be tied to the mainmast or thrown over a barrel. There was no ceremony. No speech. Just the whistle of air, the crack of leather, and the grunts of a man determined not to cry out. The number of lashes varied. A minor offense, oversleeping your shift, breaking a tool, dropping a crate, might earn 3 to 5. More serious defiance, like speaking against an officer or striking a fellow sailor, could bring 10 or more. And while 10 lashes might not sound severe from the safe distance of a warm bed, on bare skin, in humid air, under the eyes of your fellow crew, it carved something deeper than marks. It wasn't always the pain that hurt the most. It was the exposure. Being reduced, turned from a man into an example, the eyes that watched you would remember. Some with pity, some with silence, a few with grim satisfaction, and long after the pain faded, the shame remained. It clung to you in the way others stepped around you, in how they avoided your gaze, in the quiet that followed your footsteps. But not all discipline was measured. Some captains ruled with temper more than code. The punishment might not match the offense. One galleon was known for its captain who had a sailor whipped not for theft or laziness, but for singing too loudly during a night watch. Another kept a tally board on the wall of his cabin, a list of names and offenses, real or imagined. Each week, someone from the list received a lashing, whether they remembered the crime or not. The boatswain, the one who carried out the punishments, was often both feared and resented. He didn't make the rules, but he enforced them. His face, weathered and unreadable, became a symbol of consequence. Some boatswains took pleasure in the task. Others carried it like a burden. A few, when unobserved, adjusted the swing of the rope to soften the blow. But most did as they were told. Discipline was duty. And to question it was to risk becoming the next one bound. And then there was keel hauling. It didn't happen often. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't clean. But when a captain wanted to send a message, something permanent, he might order it. The condemned man was tied to a rope that looped beneath the hull of the ship. He was then dragged under from one side of the vessel to the other, across the barnacle-crusted belly of the galleon. The goal was not always death, but it was never mercy. The risk of drowning was high, so was injury. The underside of a ship, especially after months at sea, was sharp, rough, and unforgiving. Even if the sailor survived, he would carry the memory etched in skin and lungs, in the ragged rhythm of his breathing. Keel hauling was rare, though. It drew attention, created discomfort among the crew. A captain had to be certain a man deserved it, or at least that the crew would believe he did. More often, those who pushed too far were marooned, left behind at a distant port with nothing but the clothes on their back and the hope that anyone might take them in. Some captains preferred this. It required no blood. Just a signature, a wave, and then silence. Yet, for all the harshness, there was a strange structure to it. Sailors knew the rules, even if they hated them. They knew what would draw the lash and what might pass unnoticed if done quietly enough. There were invisible lines, constantly redrawn by mood and wind, and every man learned to read them in real time. And sometimes punishment was not formal at all. A broken item replaced quietly from another man's stash. A cut of rations shared as apology. A fistfight settled behind the sails, where officers wouldn't look. Not every wrong found its way to the boatswain's rope. Some were settled in salt and silence. New sailors learned quickly, not just from lectures but from observation. They saw how men reacted when the captain entered, how voices dropped, how hands moved just a little faster. They noticed who bore scars, who flinched at certain sounds. And they learned in time that life aboard was not about fairness. It was about rhythm, obedience, survival, and yet, even under that rigid order, humanity persisted. After the lashings, a crewmate might offer water, a strip of cloth, a quiet word. No apologies, no rebellion, just a gesture, an acknowledgement. You suffered and I saw. And now, we row together again? As you lie still now, picture that deck once more. The night is quiet, the sails sway. A man stands beside the mast, his shirt torn, his back raw. He breathes slowly. The crew has returned to work. And though he says nothing, the ship remembers. While the main deck buzzed with orders and sunlight, it was in the shadows between crates, beneath floorboards, and behind false panels that the ship's second story unfolded. Some called it survival, others called it theft. The Crown called it treason. But for those living week to week on briny stew and stale bread, it was simply a way to leave the voyage with something more than bruises and salt-dried skin. Our galleon was a floating marketplace. Some crewmen brought wares from home buttons, lace, small knives, beads carved from olive wood. These could be traded at colonial ports for strange fruits, feathers, tobacco, or information. Bottles of wine marked for mass, but enjoyed after hours, passed between hands like hot coals, their contents unknown but urgent. Officially, everyone aboard a galleon was accounted for. But unofficially, things got hazy. A local guide invited aboard at the last minute, a nobleman's cousin traveling incognito. A woman dressed as a boy, claiming to be a page. These passengers rarely appeared on rosters. They lived in borrowed hammocks, ate when others looked away, disembarked quickly, without farewell. Others arrived in crates of grain, their presence not revealed until sacks moved of their own accord. Footsteps heard in the lower hold when no one was below. A crate that changed position overnight. These oddities were explained away. Always. Sleepwalking, loose knots, imagination. Not because they were greedy. Always, but because they were human. They wanted more than just salt pork and backbreaking work. They wanted insurance, a future, a secret worth keeping. And somewhere, tucked behind a crate marked dried beans, there's a box, not listed, not opened, not yet. But on long voyages, when time unraveled and days bled into nights, the crew grew sensitive to change. One missing object could turn into a story. One unexplained knock might become a warning. In one curious tale, a sailor claimed a rat on his ship wore a tiny copper ring on its tail. No one believed him until another man swore he saw it too. Days later, disappearing into a wall with something shiny in its mouth. Some bore wax seals. Others were folded into tight triangles, corners blackened to discourage tampering. Most were written in ink that faded quickly in sunlight. There was no running to shore, no reporting to a higher authority. The ship was its own country, its own law, and within that floating world, justice was whatever the captain could enforce, and silence was its own survival tool. Some were addressed to lovers, others to merchants. A few to no one at all coded messages meant for the wrong eyes. One letter, found years later tucked into a book of saints, simply read, "He knows. Tell no one. Burn this." There was no name, no sender. In one case, a missionary carried a scroll written in Hebrew, hidden within a flute. He claimed it was for translation. Others suspected it was something else entirely. One day, he was simply there sharing a deckhand's bowl, sleeping beside the pigs. He never gave a full name, spoke little, but he fixed nets with a precision that made others look twice. Helped navigate by stars, though he claimed never to have studied them. Some said he was running from a duel. Others believed he was sent to observe the ship. He vanished one night before port. No one saw him go. But when a crate of ivory disappeared the same night, the two events became forever linked in whispers. He refused to play the flute even when asked. It had been inspected mid-voyage and signed off. What it once held was never determined. Another barrel arrived sealed with 3 different kinds of wax. Inside were textiles from the east, carefully wrapped in plain brown cloth, each one bearing tiny stitched symbols along the edge. No merchant claimed them. They were auctioned quietly. The buyer? A man who never gave his name and paid in coin no one recognized. A man who overheard a deal made in the hold might receive a favor to keep it to himself, a ration doubled. Some ignored it if the crew worked hard and stayed quiet. Others took a cut, discreetly. A pouch placed outside their cabin door, a sealed letter they never opened. It was a dance delicate and necessary. Too strict, and the crew might grow resentful. Too lax, and the ship could attract the wrong attention at port. The trick was balance. A lookout cupboard, or a share of the spoils when they reached land. Secrets were currency. You didn't need to hide anything yourself to benefit from something hidden. Just knowing who carried what was sometimes enough to make the voyage a little more comfortable. A sailor with good timing might sell his belt for a smoked fish, or a torn page of a psalm book for a carved charm said to keep storms away. Officially, such trades were frowned upon. Unofficially, they kept morale steady and pockets slightly heavier. There was also a market for silence. Captains weren't blind. Most had learned over time that a certain amount of smuggling was inevitable. Even priests aboard had their secrets. A crucifix hollowed out to store relics, and there were the letters. Always the letters. Then there were the passengers who were not quite passengers. One such figure was known only as Diego. No one knew where he boarded. The cargo itself sometimes told stories. In one case, a crate marked glassware arrived in Seville, completely empty. No shards, no straw, nothing. Even more mysterious were the things no one packed. Rats, for instance. Every galleon had them. But some came from other ships, sneaking aboard in the dark. Other stowaways were less tangible, a smell that came and went. And always the sea surrounded all, wide, indifferent. Despite the risks, men continued to smuggle. They continued to hide things in barrels, sew coins into their collars, carry messages on scraps of silk inside their boots. As the ship rolled gently through a darkening sea, those secrets shifted in their hiding places, unseen, unspoken, waiting to be discovered. Or never. And as you drift now, eye soft and breath slow, imagine a quiet space in the cargo hold. The lantern is low. The floor creaks just once. Chapter 10. The Ghost Fleet of the Caribbean Segment 1. The Caribbean Sea, with its shimmering turquoise waters and endless horizons, was for many centuries the stage for the grand drama of empire. Yet beneath its beauty lay a history woven with tales of ships that vanished, fleets that sailed without crews, and whispered legends that drifted on the wind like lost souls. These stories spoke of the so-called Ghost Fleet, a collection of vessels said to haunt the Caribbean, sailing silently through fog and moonlight, their decks empty but still moving, their sails full, though no hands pulled the ropes. These ghost ships were not just the stuff of sailors' tales, though they often started there. They carried weight in port towns and naval reports, with whispers of sightings passed between captains and fishermen. To understand this fleet, you must imagine the region during the height of Spanish colonial power. The Caribbean was not a peaceful place. It was a crossroads of trade and conflict. Pirates prowled the shipping lanes, hurricanes ravaged coasts, disease stalked every harbor. And with so much at stake, stories grew in the shadows, stories meant to warn, to explain, or simply to give shape to the unknown. One of the earliest and most persistent legends tells of a fleet of Spanish galleons that sailed out of Havana in the late 16th century, laden with gold and silver bound for Spain. The night was clear, the sea calm. But as they passed through the windward passage, a sudden, unnatural fog descended. The ships were separated by the mist. When dawn broke, many were missing. Those that remained returned with no crew aboard, their decks empty save for the flapping of torn sails and the occasional flutter of a dying flag. What happened to the sailors was never explained, and the fleet itself vanished from official records. Fishermen and islanders spoke of hearing the creak of rigging and the distant clang of bells in the dead of night, even when no ship was near. Sometimes a glowing light would appear offshore, too steady to be a lantern, too bright for a star. These lights would fade just as a small boat approached. And always after such sightings, there were tales of misfortune catchers that vanished. Storms that appeared without warning, or boats that returned late, their crews pale and silent. The Spanish themselves tried to investigate. Expeditions were sent to track down the missing ships. Search parties scoured the reefs and bays. Divers retrieved fragments of wood, rusted anchors, and sometimes strange, unidentifiable artifacts. But no sign of the vanished crews was ever found. Their absence only fueled the legends further. One popular theory among contemporary sailors was that the fleet had been cursed, that the gold they carried had been stolen from sacred sites, or that the sailors had committed acts, small or great, that angered the sea itself. The superstition was both a warning and a comfort. If misfortune came, it was not random, it was deserved. And if the sea claimed you, it was because you had crossed a line unseen. These beliefs influenced behavior on other ships. Captains ordered prayers and mass before departure. Crews were encouraged to confess sins openly. Offerings were made sometimes to saints, sometimes to gods remembered from old worlds. The idea was to appease whatever forces ruled the waters, human or otherwise. Some even carried charms and talismans said to repel ghosts or bad luck. These objects were passed quietly from hand to hand, treasured more than silver. There were also tales of sailors who claimed to board ghost ships. Stories of men stepping onto a deck that was cold and silent, with no sign of life but the sound of water dripping from rigging and the flutter of aged sails. In these encounters, time behaved oddly. Days passed without movement. Voices whispered in corridors that led nowhere. Some men returned from these boards, changed, quiet, haunted, sometimes unable to speak of what they saw. Others never returned at all. One such story comes from a young cabin boy who reportedly found himself alone on a ghost galleon. He described endless decks stretching into darkness, faces that appeared and disappeared in reflections on polished brass, and a voice calling him by name from the depths. When he was rescued by his own shipmates, his hair had turned white, and his eyes carried a distance no one could bridge. He never fully recovered his place among the living crew. The idea of ghost ships was not unique to the Caribbean, of course. Across maritime cultures, such stories exist, each shaped by local beliefs and fears. But in this region, where history, violence, and myth intermingled tightly, the ghost fleet became a powerful symbol. It was a reminder of what the sea could take, and of the thin line between life and oblivion on the waves. And then there were the practical consequences. The fear of ghost ships led some captains to avoid certain routes or nights altogether. Convoys altered schedules to avoid misty passages. Fishermen steered clear of areas where lights flickered without explanation. These decisions shaped trade, settlement, and even naval strategy. The supernatural was, in its own way, part of the real world. Yet, as with all legends, there was likely a kernel of truth behind the tales. Hurricanes could easily scatter fleets, leaving damaged ships adrift. Crew could be lost to illness or combat, with survivors forced to abandon ship. Fog and storm could hide wrecks and bodies for months. A ship with a lost crew might drift for days, her sails torn but still catching wind. Observers might glimpse such a vessel, mistaking it for a ghost. Stories grow with retelling, shaped by fear and wonder. But whether fact or fancy, the ghost fleet remains a haunting image. Silent ships gliding across the moonlit Caribbean, carrying memories and mysteries beneath their tattered flags. A world where the boundary between past and present, life and death, is as fluid as the ocean itself. As you drift now towards sleep, picture a silvered sea under a cold moon. A lone ship sails silently, sails full but empty of voice. The water laps gently against her sides, whispering secrets to those who listen. And somewhere, far from sight, the crew waits, no longer bound by flesh, but part of the endless tide. Stories of the ghost fleet often blurred the lines between fact and folklore, but they spoke to a deeper truth about life at sea, that ever-present specter of uncertainty and loss. Sailors, hardened by storms and toil, were keenly aware that the ocean did not guarantee safe passage. Every voyage might be their last, every ship might become a ghost, and every calm night might hide a tempest waiting to be unleashed. One account, passed down through generations of Caribbean fishermen, tells of a morning when a crew spotted a ship on the horizon black as a shadow, sails shredded, moving without wind. As the galleon drew closer, the men saw no flag, no crew, only empty decks and broken rigging. Some claimed the ship was the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a treasure galleon lost decades earlier. Others believed it was the embodiment of the souls claimed by the sea, forever condemned to roam. The fear such stories inspired was not simply superstition. It was survival. Seafarers learned to respect silence, darkness, and the unspoken laws of the deep. They lit lanterns not just for navigation, but to ward off unseen presences. They avoid certain waters, especially during fog and storms, when the boundary between reality and nightmare seemed thinnest. They told tales of the almas perdidas, the lost souls, who might reach out from the water to claim the unwary. The ghost ships were sometimes seen as omens, warnings of impending disaster or death. A fleet sighting was whispered about in taverns and port cities as a bad sign. Captains altered courses, fearing curses or the wrath of the sea gods. At times, these legends served a practical purpose, encouraging caution and vigilance among crews who might otherwise grow complacent. Yet, within the fear lay fascination. Some captains sought out these phantom ships, hoping to catch a glimpse or unravel the mystery. They believed that understanding the supernatural was part of mastering the sea itself. The lines between bravery and madness blurred, and for the crews who faced months of isolation, the ghost ships became companions, symbols of the unknown, and reminders that the ocean was more than just water and wind. Interestingly, the phenomenon of ghost fleets was not always negative. In some stories, the ghost ships appeared as protectors, silent guardians who warded off storms or enemy vessels. Mariners prayed to see a ghost ship as a sign that their voyage would be safe. The paradox of fear and hope intertwined, a reflection of the complex relationship humans have always held with the sea. The Caribbean's history is written in layers of such contradictions: beauty and danger, wealth and poverty, life and death. The ghost fleet embodies these tensions, a metaphor for the fragile line between power and vulnerability. Each silent vessel is a reminder that the ocean claims all in the end, regardless of flags, fortunes, or faith. Ace tales, passed through whispers and wood smoke, became part of the cultural fabric of the region. Songs were composed, dances performed, and paintings created inspired by the ghostly fleet. Even today, these stories capture imaginations, drawing visitors and scholars alike to ports where the sea keeps its secrets well. And so, as you rest, imagine standing on the deck of your own ship, the night thick around you. The stars blink high above, but just beyond the edge of sight, a faint shape glides through the mist. No sound but the soft splash of waves, no sign of life, yet unmistakably present. You hold your breath, and in that moment, the world feels both infinite and intimately close. The sea whispers its ancient stories, and you listen, gently rocking with its tide. Chapter 11. A Day in the Life of a Cabin Boy. To understand life aboard a 16th century Spanish galleon, it helps to step into the shoes of the youngest among the crew, the cabin boy. He was often no older than 12 or 13, small for his age, and carrying the weight of a world much larger than his frame. His days were long, his duties many, and his place precarious. Using damp wood and dried seaweed, he coaxed the embers into flame. Smoke filled the small space quickly, stinging eyes and throat. But the boy endured, knowing that a meal for the crew depended on his careful hands. But in his story, we find a lens on the ship's daily rhythm, its hidden hardships, and the quiet resilience that kept it afloat. There was no room for complaint or explanation. Silence and speed were his allies. The boy learned quickly which tasks took priority and which could wait. Sometime during brief lulls, he would sneak a piece of dried fruit or nibble a crust hidden behind barrels. This meant carrying platters through narrow corridors, pouring wine, and occasionally listening at doors to the whispered plans and quarrels of men who shaped kingdoms but rarely smiled. He learned to keep secrets, to look away when tempers flared, to appear neither frightened nor curious. And for a cabin boy, growing up fast was not a choice. It was necessity. He carries not just water and food, but the fragile hope that he might live to see land again. That one day, his story will be more than survival. That one day he will be free. Occasionally, he would watch the sea from a quiet corner of the deck, the salt air filling his lungs and the endless blue stretching before him like a promise. He might be woken in the middle of the night to fetch a lantern for a sick sailor, or to deliver a message from the captain. Falls from rigging, heavy ropes swinging unpredictably, or sudden shifts in the ship's balance could mean serious injury. Some sailors took the boy under their wing, teaching him knots, songs, or the names of the stars. Others saw him as a burden or a target for mockery. The boy learned to navigate these relationships with care, knowing that his survival depended as much on people as on skill. One misstep near the edge could send him into the water, where the chances of rescue were slim and the sea merciless. Sleep came in stolen moments, curled behind crates, leaning against a mast, or wherever the ship's movement allowed. Dreams were brief and often disturbed. There was little room for error. The cook, often gruff and impatient, supervised with sharp eyes and sharper words. Any mistake might mean a lashing or worse, starvation for someone. Morning began early, often before dawn's first light touched the horizon. The cabin boy would rise from a narrow pallet stacked in a corner of the captain's quarters or near the galley, if he was lucky enough to have a sheltered spot at all. His mattress was thin, filled with straw, and his blanket rough. Sometimes the cold crept into his bones before the day even started. A small village, a mother's embrace. Bread fresh from an oven. The sound of laughter carried on a breeze. These thoughts were his refuge, whispered to himself like a prayer. His first task was to stir the fires. The galley was the heart of the ship's daily sustenance and a place of both warmth and smoke. He carried messages between officers, fetched fresh water from the casks, and cleaned the captain's cabin. He was expected to be invisible, yet always ready. He polished brass fittings until they gleamed faintly, swept dust from corners, and arranged the captain's maps with careful hands. Next came the preparation of food. Bread had to be sliced, salted meat cut into manageable pieces, and pots scrubbed. Water, scarce and precious, was rationed carefully. While the ship's men began their labor on deck hoisting sails, repairing rigging, manning the oars, the cabin boy's world was smaller, but no less demanding. Mistakes were not tolerated. If the cabin boy spilled wine, broke a glass, or forgot an errand, he was reprimanded swiftly. Despite the hardship, the boy found moments of small freedom. He was often called upon to serve the officers at meals. The cabin boy's duties extended into the dark hours. There was danger, too. The boy was as vulnerable as anyone. He learned quickly which crewmen were kind and which were cruel. In the rare moments when the sun warmed the deck and the sea was calm, the cabin boy would imagine what life might be like ashore. But the voyage was not about wishes. It was about endurance. Day after day, task after task, step after careful step. As you rest now, picture this young figure moving quietly through the shadows of the ship, his hands steady despite trembling, his eyes wide but steady. As the sun rose higher, the ship settled into its rhythm. The cabin boy's day unfolded with a series of small but essential tasks, each demanding attention and care. The scent of the sea mingled with the sharp tang of sweat and tar. Rats were a constant nuisance, and the boy sometimes chased them away or tried to keep the food stores secure. There was often a cat aboard, valued for its skill at controlling vermin, and the boy sometimes fed it scraps, earning a quiet companionship in return. It was the smell he would come to know well, the smell of life on the ocean, of wood soaked in brine, of endless effort. A sudden squall might lash the deck with rain, and the cabin boy had to find shelter quickly, often in cramped, dark spaces where the ship creaked and groaned ominously. He learned to steady his breath, to keep moving, and to trust the sailors around him. He listened to stories told by older sailors' tales of distant lands, battles fought, storms survived, and ghosts seen on the waves. The hammock swung gently with the ship's motion, and the sound of water against the hull was a constant lullaby. But sleep was often interrupted by the call of a watchman, the shout of a sailor, or the sudden lurch of the ship as it caught a wave. He learned the names of the crew, the pattern of the stars, the language of the sea. He began to see himself not just as a servant, but as part of something larger, a small but vital thread in the fabric of the ship's life. These stories were part history, part legend, and part warning. He bore the aches, the hunger, the cold, and the loneliness with a resilience that surprised even himself. Each day was a test of endurance and adaptation. Each task was a step toward survival. The crew worked in unison, pulling ropes, adjusting sails, securing cargo. Each man knew his role, and the boy did his best to keep pace. The scent of wet wood and salt filled the air, mingling with the distant thunder of waves. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the rigging like silver threads. The cabin boy helped prepare the food and ensure the captain's table was set. The night air cool against his skin, the stars shining far above. He breathed slowly, dreams lightly, and waits waiting for dawn, for the next day, for the journey to end. He moved swiftly, aware that the officers expected precision even in small things. He helped bring fresh water from the barrels below deck to the officers' quarters, carrying the heavy wooden buckets with aching arms, careful not to spill a single drop. Of tasting fresh bread and feeling grass beneath bare feet. The hope that one day the boy would no longer be bound to the ship, but free to make his own way in the world. Water was precious, rationed tightly to keep the crew alive, and even a small loss was noticed. He swept the deck with a worn broom, chasing salt and sand from the wood. The cabin boy also had to tend to the ship's animals. At midday, the crew gathered for their meal, a thin stew of salted meat and hard bread, flavored with whatever herbs or vegetables could be spared. Between tasks, he learned from watching. Sailors mended sails with practiced fingers, tying knots that would not slip. The helmsman studied the waves and wind, adjusting the wheel with a steady grip. The navigator traced constellations on a chart, his finger lingering over familiar stars. The boy soaked in these lessons, knowing that one day he might be called upon to perform them himself. There were moments of danger, too. During storms, the boy's fear was tempered by the knowledge that panic was the enemy. At night, the boy's duties continued. He helped light lanterns, ensuring paths were safe and that the captain's cabin was lit for charts to be studied. Sleep was a scarce commodity. The boy curled up in whatever corner was available, sometimes sharing a small berth with a sailor. Throughout it all, the cabin boy carried the quiet burden of youth in a harsh world. As the voyage stretched on, the boy grew in skill and understanding. Yet beneath the hardening, there remained a flicker of hope, the hope of reaching land again, of seeing a sky without sails. As you rest now, imagine the boy lying quietly in his hammock, the ship's gentle rocking a cradle. Chapter 12. The Royal Fifth. Gold for the Spanish crown, for every treasure-laden galleon that sailed from the New World back to Spain. There was an invisible passenger aboard, a claim the crown made on all riches that crossed the ocean. Known as the Royal Fifth, this tax demanded that 1/5 of all precious metals, gems, and other valuables be surrendered to the king. It was a claim rooted in law, faith, and the assertion of imperial power, a reminder that no matter the distance or danger, the spoils belong first and foremost to the Spanish monarchy. Imagine the moment when a galleon finally docked at Seville's bustling port after months at sea. The crew, worn and weathered, watched as officials climbed aboard to inspect the cargo. Crates were opened. Silver bars were counted, gold dust weighed on scales, all while the ship's men waited anxiously, knowing that their share of any profits depended on the crown's satisfaction. The system was complex. The quinto real, or royal fifth, was meant to fund the monarchy's expenses, its armies, courts, and ships. It was the backbone of Spain's imperial ambitions. Yet it also became a source of tension. Merchants, captains, and crew members all understood that the tax reduced their own fortunes considerably. Smuggling, bribery, and corruption soon followed, as those aboard sought to keep more than their legal share. Records from the time show that some captains resorted to elaborate methods to hide treasure-false compartments in the hull, secret caches in barrels, or coded entries in the ship's logbook. Crew members often participated in these schemes, quietly exchanging coins or gems during the long watches. The risks were great. Discovery could mean severe punishment. But the lure of extra wealth was irresistible. The Royal Fifth also created a chain of custody. Once the treasure reached Seville, It was transported under heavy guard to the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade. Here, officials audited shipments, recorded entries, and prepared the wealth for transport to the royal treasury in Madrid. Each stage was monitored, but even the most diligent record keepers could not prevent theft or loss entirely. Despite the crown's claims, not all treasure made it home. Pirates prowled the seas, waiting for vulnerable ships. Hurricanes shattered vessels on rocky coasts. Accidents and miscalculations led to loss. Some cargo rotted in damp holds. The journey was perilous, and the crown's wealth was never guaranteed. But when it did arrive, the impact was immense. Gold and silver fueled not only royal ambitions, but also the wider European economy. Mines were expanded, armies funded, and artworks commissioned. Yet the influx of precious metals also brought inflation, social change, and unintended consequences that reshaped continents. For the crew, the Royal Fifth was a distant concept, an abstract deduction from their meager shares. Most sailors received small payments, often delayed or reduced. Their lives were not made wealthy by the voyages they endured. Instead, they eked out survival, their labor enriching others far above the deck. Officials overseeing the tax were powerful figures. Some wielded authority with fairness, others with greed. Bribes were common, deals were struck. In one notorious case, a customs officer was discovered accepting lavish gifts in exchange for undervaluing shipments. He vanished before trial, his whereabouts unknown. The tax system also influenced ship design and cargo packing. Captains preferred silver over gold dust because bars were easier to count and harder to conceal. Certain goods were taxed differently. Officials kept meticulous lists of tax items, jewels, spices, textiles, and more. Yet the system was always one step behind those seeking to evade it. There were also cultural dimensions. The crown framed the royal fifth as a divine right. Royal decrees cited God's sanction for the tax. Churches received a portion of the wealth. Masses were held to bless voyages and treasure. This fusion of faith and finance reinforced the crown's authority, making resistance difficult. Yet beneath the pomp and ceremony lay a reality of tension. Merchants and sailors grumbled, smugglers thrived. Some colonies resented the heavy hand of taxation, sowing seeds of future unrest. The Royal Fifth was both a source of strength and a catalyst for conflict. As you rest now, picture the glittering silver bars stacked carefully in a guarded vault. The soft echo of footsteps on marble floors. The whispered negotiations behind closed doors. Far away, the crew sleeps, unaware of the gold's journey or the price they pay. The treasure's voyage is not over until it reaches the crown, and even then, its story continues in the halls of power and whispers of the sea. The Royal Fifth was more than a mere tax. It was a symbol of imperial power and a reminder of the crown's reach across oceans and continents. But it also shaped the lives of those who came into contact with it, for better and worse. The promise of wealth made men dream, yet the realities of extraction and control made many endure hardship and loss. Inside the Casa de Contratación, officials worked tirelessly to account for every coin and gem. Ledgers filled with names, quantities, and values were studied under dim candlelight. Errors were scrutinized and discrepancies investigated. Some documents show pages of meticulous calculations, with careful notes about ship arrivals, losses, and recoveries. Officers and captains received larger shares, often legally defined and supplemented by private agreements. Common sailors hoped for small bonuses, though many times their earnings were meager or delayed. The wealth of empire rarely trickled down evenly. This imbalance shaped relations aboard ships and among crews, fueling tensions that sometimes erupted into conflict. Others reveal hints of forgery or omission, a delicate dance of honesty and deceit. For many, the treasure was a symbol of national pride, a source of fascination and hope. From the depths of a mine in the Americas, carried across stormy seas, counted by officials, melted by artisans, and finally placed into a noble's hand. Its path is long and winding, marked by hands that are both gentle and harsh. And even as it glows with promise, it carries with it the echoes of countless lives intertwined with the fate of empire. For others, it was a reminder of distant struggles they could neither touch nor change. They negotiated with merchants, protected their crew's interests, and sought to balance duty to the crown with practical needs. Others prioritized personal gain, exploiting their position to amass fortunes at the expense of men under their command. The line between loyalty and greed was thin and often crossed. The treasure was not simply locked away. It was processed, melted down, and recast. Trials were public affairs, meant to deter others and preserve the crown's image. The wealth it generated funded churches, adorned with gold leaf, statues of saints, and lavish ceremonies. It financed explorations that mapped new territories and expanded knowledge. But it also fueled wars, displaced indigenous peoples, and perpetuated systems of exploitation. The glint of gold masked a darker story, one of power wielded far from the eyes of those who bore its cost. Yet outcomes varied. Some were convicted and punished severely. Others escaped with fines or pardons, thanks to connections or bribes. The system was imperfect, human, and entangled with the complexities of empire. Silver bars were stamped with royal seals, marking them as property of the crown and enabling their circulation in markets across Europe. Gold was often minted into coins, sometimes fashioned into ornate objects for nobility or the church. In these transformations, the raw riches of distant lands were turned into symbols of Spanish might and prestige. Yet behind the scenes, the journey of gold and silver was fraught with risk. Bandits and rival powers sought to intercept shipments. Ports were scenes of intrigue and violence. Guards were bribed or turned blind. Pirates like Sir Francis Drake and Henry Morgan targeted Spanish treasure fleets with ruthless precision. Their attacks disrupted trade routes, diminished royal coffers, and added to the uncertainty faced by all involved. On board the galleons themselves, the presence of the Royal Fifth influenced behavior. Crew members knew that part of the cargo was destined for the king, and this knowledge sometimes bred resentment or distrust. Smuggling became a covert form of resistance, a way for sailors and merchants to claim a piece of the wealth they helped to transport. These underground economies flourished in shadowy corners of ports and taverns. Among the sailors, the division of spoils was a constant concern. Some captains navigated these waters of profit and power with skill and caution. Historical records occasionally reveal instances where captains or officials were tried for corruption related to the Royal Fifth. Beyond economics and politics, the Royal Fifth left cultural traces. In homes and streets of Spain, ordinary citizens might see coins minted from New World silver, but remained unaware of the human toll behind them. As you drift toward rest, imagine the journey of a single gold coin. Chapter 13. Storm over the Atlantic. A Galleon's Final Hour. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and merciless, was a stage for countless stories of survival, loss, and endurance. Among these, the final hours of a galleon caught in a storm remain some of the most haunting. Imagine a ship its hull creaking under the strain of roaring winds and towering waves, sails shredded, but still holding what power they can, and a crew bracing against the tempest that seems to rise from the depths of the world itself. The storm came suddenly, as many do at sea. One moment, the sky was a dull gray, and the waves rippled softly against the wooden sides. The next, clouds gathered fast, dark and thick, blotting out the horizon. Thunder growled in the distance, rolling closer with a low, steady menace. The air shifted, heavy with salt and impending rain. Sailors scrambled to secure the rigging. Ropes flew from hand to hand as the captain barked orders, commands shouted against the howl of the wind. Every man moved with urgency, aware that delay meant disaster. The deck tilted sharply as a massive wave surged beneath the ship, tossing men and barrels alike. The smell of wet wood, salt spray, and fear mingled thickly. Cannons, usually silent guardians, were lashed tightly to the deck. But their chains rattled ominously, a metallic echo amid the chaos. Barrels of gunpowder, the lifeblood of defense, were secured with every precaution. One careless spark could ignite a catastrophe, and men moved carefully, knowing the stakes. Below deck, the cargo shifted dangerously. Barrels of gold coins, chests of spices, and crates of silk rubbed against each other, the noise muffled but relentless. The crew could hear the steady thud as the ship pitched, the creak of beams straining against the storm's force. Some clung to the walls for balance, others gripped whatever they could find. In the midst of this turmoil, prayers rose softly from corners of the ship. A whispered Hail Mary, a quick sign of the cross, a plea to saints long invoked for protection. These prayers were not loud or desperate. They were quiet requests for mercy, a thread of faith against the overwhelming power of nature. The men worked tirelessly. Some climbed the rigging to adjust sails, their bodies slick with rain, faces set with determination. Others manned the pumps below deck, battling the encroaching water as it seeped through seams and cracks. Every muscle strained. Every breath was effort. Amid the storm's fury, the captain remained a steady presence. His voice cut through the wind, guiding, commanding, calming. He knew the ship's limits and the ocean's temper. He watched the sails, the compass, and the horizon with practiced eyes. He was the tether keeping the crew's hope alive. Yet even the strongest cannot always defy the sea. As the night deepened, waves grew higher monsters made of water, rising and crashing like the anger of the gods. The ship groaned. The timbers shuddered. A mast snapped, sending splinters and rigging crashing down. Shouts rang out. Men scrambled to safety. Some were thrown overboard, swallowed instantly by the dark waters. Others fought to stay upright, clinging to ropes and rails, faces pale and eyes wide. The rain turned to sleet, sharp and biting. The cold seeped into bones long unused to rest. Through it all, the barrels of gold began to shift. Heavy, unforgiving, they rolled dangerously beneath the deck. Men rushed to secure them, knowing that if they broke free, the ship's balance could be lost. The precious cargo, source of fortune and ruin, became a hazard. As dawn approached, the storm's fury slowly waned. The wind dropped to a harsh breeze, the waves receded but still slapped fiercely against the hull. The ship was battered, scarred, but afloat. The crew was exhausted, soaked, and shaken. They counted losses, not just in men, but in supplies, in hope. They looked toward the horizon, a faint glow of light promising safety, or perhaps new challenges. The sea, though calm compared to before, still whispered warnings. The Galleon had survived the night, but its journey was far from over. As you rest now, picture that battered ship, its sails torn, its crew weary, its heart still beating strong against the vast, indifferent ocean. The storm has passed, but the memory lingers like the scent of salt on wet wood. And somewhere, within the hull, the treasure waits silent and golden, holding the promise of home. When the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, the Galleon was a shadow of its former self. The sails hung in tatters, fluttering weakly against the softening breeze. The masts, once proud and tall, leaned at odd angles, scarred by the storm's violence. The deck was littered with debris-broken ropes, shattered barrels, splintered wood, and a scent of salt and sweat hung thick in the air. The crew moved slowly, their bodies stiff and aching. Some searched for lost comrades, their voices heavy with grief and relief. Others tended to the wounded, wrapping torn clothing around cuts, offering sips of weak broth, and whispering words of comfort. The ship, battered but unbroken, groaned softly as it rocked gently on the now calmer sea. Below deck, the hold told a more fragile story. The precious cargo, gold and silver bound for the crown, lay shifted and scattered. Some crates had burst open, their contents spilled and mixed with sand and seawater. The men who had guarded these treasures worked silently to secure what remained, aware that their future fortunes and their own survival depended on it. Among the crew, the mood was sober but determined. The storm had taken much, but it had not taken their will. There was work to be done. Repairs awaited. Watches had to be kept. The journey was far from over. The captain, standing at the helm with a steady gaze, began charting a course toward the nearest port. His voice, though tired, carried the authority needed to rally the men. There were no promises of ease or safety, only the knowledge that the sea was demanding as ever. As the day wore on, some men found moments of quiet reflection. They looked out over the endless water, the vast expanse that had challenged and threatened them. The ocean was both adversary and provider capable of great destruction, yet offering passage and opportunity. For the young and old alike, the experience left an imprint, a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of nature, of the delicate balance between human endeavor and the forces beyond control. Some whispered prayers of thanks for survival. Others remained silent, their thoughts too heavy to voice. The ship, carrying its weary but resolute crew, sailed onward each creek and groan a testament to resilience. As night fell once more, the stars emerged, distant and unchanging. The watchmen took their posts, eyes scanning the dark horizon for signs of land or danger. The gentle rocking of the ship beneath them offered a lullaby, a promise that even after the fiercest storm, calm could return. You, now resting in the quiet, may find solace in the thought of that battered ship moving steadily through the night. Its journey scarred but continuing, its crew battered but unbroken. And somewhere within, the golden cargo lies silent, a quiet hope for the future. Chapter 14. The Forgotten Bones of the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast, with its warm, humid air and shifting sands, holds stories not only of empire and exploration, but also those whose lives were lost and forgotten beneath its tides. The sand is soft beneath your feet, dotted with shells and fragments of old pottery. The wind carries the scent of salt and earth, thick with the stories of centuries past. Beneath the surface, the remains of ships lost to storms and time await rediscovery, their presence almost imperceptible against the vastness of the sky. And women who powered the voyages, endured hardship, and faced the unknown. These oral histories blend fact and legend, keeping alive memories that official records overlook. Hurricanes and shifting currents have reshaped the coastline repeatedly, burying some wrecks deep beneath sand and revealing others only briefly. Each artifact recovered is treated with care, catalogued, and studied to better understand the lives aboard these ships and the conditions that led to their demise. They are reminders that history is not only written in books, but also etched into the earth and water. That beneath the beauty of the Gulf Coast lies a hidden world where stories wait to be told. Saltwater and marine life slowly consume wood and metal, transforming wreck sites into living reefs. The waves lap softly against your feet, carrying whispers of those who came before. The sand beneath your toes holds memories both known and lost. And beneath the surface, the forgotten bones sleep, cradled by the sea, waiting patiently to share their tale. This dynamic process challenges those who seek to preserve and understand these silent remnants. Some speak of ghostly figures walking the beaches at night, of whispered voices carried on the wind, and of treasures still hidden beneath the sand. Their stories are not of glory, but of endurance, loss, and the relentless passage of time. Wrecks of Spanish galleons, once glittering carriers of gold and dreams, rest quietly on the seabed. Their timbers broken and overgrown with coral, their treasures scattered and hidden. Archaeologists, diving carefully among coral and silt, uncover artifacts, coins, weapons, ceramics that tell of lives lived and lost. Each find is a fragment of a larger puzzle, a glimpse into a world where danger was constant and survival was uncertain. Along the dunes and marshes, bones lie buried, silent witnesses to voyages that ended in tragedy. Imagine standing on a quiet stretch of beach where the waves gently kiss the shore. These shipwrecks are more than sunken vessels. They are tombs and time capsules. The bones scattered along the Gulf Coast are often anonymous. They belong to sailors, soldiers, slaves, and passengers, their names lost to history. Some were claimed by the sea during fierce storms. Others perished in conflicts or disease. Their bodies washed ashore or settled with their ships beneath the waves. In many cases, these remains were hastily buried in dunes or shallow graves, their resting places marked only by the passing seasons. Despite their silence, these forgotten bones speak volumes. They remind us of the human cost of empire, the men along the coast. Local communities have long passed down tales of shipwrecks and lost crews. The natural environment of the Gulf Coast adds layers of complexity to these stories. In recent years, technology has allowed for more detailed exploration. Sonar mapping, Underwater drones and careful excavation have brought new discoveries to light. Yet many wrecks remain untouched, resting in quiet solitude beneath the waves. As you rest now, imagine standing at the water's edge, watching the tide come in slowly. The Gulf Coast's sandy shores have long been a resting place for those lost at sea, but also a site where past and present converge. Over centuries, shifting tides and storms have uncovered relics and remains, revealing glimpses of lives abruptly ended and voyages unfinished. Sometimes these artifacts are beautifully preserved. A silver cross, a glass bottle intact despite centuries underwater, a map fragment etched on weathered parchment. Though names may be lost, these bones represent individuals who endured the same fears, hopes, and hardships that shape all human stories. Forensic analysis can sometimes reveal age, diet, and cause of death, painting a quiet portrait of lives shaped by ocean and empire. Other times they are worn and broken, yet no less poignant. Others show signs of disease or malnutrition, reminders of the harsh conditions aboard ship, but also about the countless lives whose names were never recorded but whose existence shaped the world. Their stories, though silent, echo through time and the waves and sands of the Gulf Coast. Their journey ended long ago, but their presence remains, a part of the sea's timeless embrace. These silent witnesses speak of a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where every day brought new challenges. Beneath, the bones of men and women lie in peaceful sleep, their stories folded into the endless rhythm of the ocean. The tide washes in softly, carrying memories and dreams across centuries. Each discovery is a delicate thread connecting us to a time when the world was far larger and more mysterious. Archaeologists working along the coast often find themselves piecing together fragments from multiple wrecks, timbers from one, ceramics from another, coins scattered across the site, each telling a story of its own. Salt water slowly corrodes metal. Sand shifts unpredictably. Storms can erase years of work in moments. Yet, each effort to study and protect these sites enriches our understanding of the past and honors those forgotten. The human remains found on the Gulf Coast are treated with profound respect. In coastal communities, tales of sea spirits and lost sailors mingle with Christian prayers, creating a tapestry of belief that honors those who rest beneath the sand. Annual ceremonies remember shipwreck victims, blending history with reverence. Some bones bear marks of violence, scars of battle or accidents. Local traditions have grown around these finds. Preserving these sites is a delicate task. The Gulf Coast environment is dynamic, and underwater archaeology requires patience and care. The bones and artifacts serve as a reminder that history is not just about the great and famous. As you rest, imagine the sea gently rolling over a sunken ship, its timbers entwined with coral and seaweed. In this quiet moment, you are connected to those forgotten souls. As our voyage comes to a close, imagine the vast ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, deep, mysterious, and timeless. The stories we've traveled through, the hardships endured. Below deck, the treasures sought across distant horizons, the ghostly fleets that haunt the waves. And the forgotten bones resting beneath the Gulf's shifting sands. Each remind us of a world both far away and profoundly human. Those galleons were more than ships. They were floating worlds filled with hope, fear, courage, and loss. Men and boys who braved storms and punishments, who navigated by stars and superstition, whose lives were shaped by duty and survival. The gold they carried was not just metal, but the embodiment of empires, ambitions, and dreams often built on sacrifice in silence. Today, as you listen in quiet comfort, you rest far from those turbulent seas. The creak of wood and roar of wind replaced by calm air and gentle stillness. The ocean's danger replaced by the safety of your own space. It's a contrast that invites reflection, how far we have come, and how closely we remain connected to those who came before. In the stillness, allow yourself to drift. Let the rhythm of your breath match the gentle sway of waves long past. Imagine the stars above guiding you, steady and sure. Feel the soft embrace of peace settling over you, wrapping around like a warm blanket on a cool night. The past may hold storms and shadows, but it also holds stories of endurance, adaptation, and quiet bravery. And in their telling, we find comfort. A reminder that no matter how dark the night or how fierce the sea, dawn always comes. Rest now. Let the ocean's timeless song lull you deeper into calm. The ships sail on in memory, the crew rests beneath distant skies, and you journey onward into peaceful sleep. Good night. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.